The blood spreading across the snow looked black in the twilight, and Sarah Chen couldn't tell anymore if she was still screaming or if the sound had simply become part of the wind that howled down from the Rockies. The grizzly's massive head swung toward her, and in that moment, standing in her grandfather's yard, with his body crumpled 20 feet away, she understood with crystalline clarity that everything she'd learned in 3 tours with the Canadian Armed Forces, every combat scenario she'd survived in Afghanistan, had been preparation for this exact second. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know, what Bradley Whitmore and his father's development company and that corrupt wildlife officer, Dean Pratchett, couldn't have possibly anticipated, was that taking everything from the Chen family would be the biggest mistake of their entitled lives. Subscribe now to witness how a bereaved granddaughter transforms grief into justice, how a community rises up against those who value profit over lives, and how the truth about what really happened on that November evening would bring down everyone who thought they were untouchable. But let's rewind to where it all began, 14 months earlier, when Michael Chen was still alive and the Double C Ranch was still whole. The October morning arrived cold and crystalline over the Alberta foothills, the kind of day that made Michael Chen grateful for every single one of his 67 years. He stood on his porch with coffee steaming in his hands, watching the Herefords move across the south pasture like rust-colored clouds against golden grass. His wife, Linda, called from inside about breakfast getting cold, her voice carrying the gentle exasperation of 42 years of marriage to a man who'd rather watch cattle than eat. Michael smiled and took one more moment, breathing in air so clean it almost hurt, watching the way morning light painted the peaks of the Rockies in shades of pink and gold. This land had been in Linda's family for 3 generations, 1,200 acres of prime grazing land backed up against crown land and the wilderness beyond. And Michael had spent 35 years proving to her father's ghost that a Chinese immigrant kid from Vancouver could make a proper rancher after all. Inside, Linda had laid out eggs and bacon and toast with her homemade choke cherry jam, the radio playing CBC News about pandemic restrictions, and case counts that felt distant and unreal in their corner of the world. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that only comes from decades of knowing someone completely. Linda's hands, weathered and strong from ranch work, spread jam with the precise movements of someone who'd done the same thing thousands of times. She'd been a teacher before they married, had given up a position in Calgary to move back to the ranch when her father's health failed, and Michael had never heard her express a moment of regret. Their daughter Amy had been the one who couldn't wait to leave, who'd fled to Toronto the day after high school graduation, and stayed gone except for obligatory Christmas visits, sending back a granddaughter named Sarah, who spent summers on the ranch and actually seemed to love it. Michael finished his coffee and pulled on his work jacket, the canvas Carhartt that Linda had given him 10 Christmases ago, worn soft now and stained with machine oil and cow manure and the honest dirt of working land. The morning routine never changed. Check the water tanks, walk the fence line in the north pasture, count heads, look for any animals showing signs of illness or distress. His border collie Magpie appeared from wherever she'd been sleeping and fell into step beside him, her black and white coat gleaming in the morning sun. The dog was 9 years old and smart as any human Michael had ever met, could move cattle with just a look, and always knew when something was wrong before Michael did. They were walking the fence line when Magpie's ears went up, her whole body going rigid in that way that made Michael's hand automatically reach for the rifle he'd left back at the house. Stupid. Sloppy. He'd gotten complacent after years without serious predator trouble. The wire fence was down in 3 places, the post snapped clean through, and in the soft earth, Michael could see the tracks. Grizzly, big one, based on the size of the prints. His stomach went cold. They hadn't had a bear this close to the buildings in over 15 years, not since the drought year when the berry crop failed, and everything wild came down from the high country looking for food. Michael pulled out his phone and called Linda, told her to stay inside, told her he was coming back for the rifle. Then he called Fish and Wildlife, got a bored-sounding woman, who put him through to an officer named Pratchett, who listened to Michael's report with audible skepticism. "You sure it's fresh sign, Mr. Chen? We haven't had any grizzly reports in your area this season." Michael looked at the tracks, still sharp-edged in the damp earth, looked at the fresh scat steaming in the cold air. I'm looking at it right now. Big boar, probably 400 pounds or better. He went through my fence like it was paper. Pratchett sighed like Michael was wasting his time. Well, Mr. Chen, you know grizzlies are a protected species in Alberta. Unless there's an immediate threat to human safety, our policy is to monitor and observe. I'll make a note in your file, and if you see the bear again, give us a call. Meanwhile, I'd suggest making sure your attractants are secured. Garbage, pet food, that sort of thing. Michael felt his jaw tighten. Officer Pratchett, I've been ranching this land for 35 years. I know about attractants. This bear took down my fence, and he's inside my grazing area with my cattle. That makes it my problem. Another sigh. I'll send someone out to look at your fence, Mr. Chen, but that'll be a few days at least. We're short-staffed with the pandemic and all. In the meantime, just keep your distance, and the bear will move along on his own. Michael hung up and stood there holding his phone, watching Magpie sniff along the bear's trail, keep his distance, on his own land. With 1,200 acres of cattle that represented every dollar he and Linda had in the world. He thought about his granddaughter, Sarah, 26 now, and just back from her third tour in Afghanistan, recuperating from an IED blast that had killed 2 of her unit. She'd be coming up for Thanksgiving in a few weeks, and Michael had promised her peace and quiet and no explosions. He looked at the tracks again, following their line with his eyes toward the timber on the slope above his property. The bear had come down from the high country, probably looking for one last feed before denning up for winter. Under normal circumstances, Michael would have respected that, would have given the animal space and time to move on. But something felt wrong about this, something in the way Pratchett had dismissed his concerns with barely concealed contempt, something in the casual assumption that an old rancher didn't know what he was looking at. He spent the rest of the day reinforcing the fence, stringing electric wire that would give the bear a shock if it tried to push through again. Linda helped him, handing him tools and fence staples, not saying much because she knew him well enough to recognize when he was working something out in his head. By the time they finished, the sun was dropping toward the mountains, and the temperature was falling fast. They walked back to the house together, Magpie ranging ahead, and Michael felt the weight of the landscape pressing down on him in a way it hadn't in years. This land was everything. His marriage, his livelihood, his identity, all tied up in these 1,200 acres that would probably be subdivided and destroyed within 5 years of his death. Because Amy sure as hell wasn't coming back to ranch it. That night, Michael lay awake, listening to Linda breathe beside him, listening to the house settle and creak, and thinking about the bear. He'd killed 2 grizzlies in his life, both times when he'd had no choice. Both times leaving him with a sick feeling that had lasted for weeks. A grizzly wasn't like shooting a coyote or even a black bear. There was something primordial about them, something that demanded respect, even when they were tearing apart your livestock or threatening your family. They'd been here first, after all, these mountains and foothills their home, long before anyone drew property lines or strung fences. But respect didn't mean you had to be a victim, didn't mean you couldn't defend what was yours when the situation demanded it. 3 days later, Michael was checking the north pasture when he found the kill. A yearling Hereford heifer, maybe 500 pounds, torn open and partially cached under a pile of branches and dirt. The bear had eaten the hindquarters and the organs, leaving the head and front quarters intact, covering the carcass the way grizzlies do when they plan to return. Michael stood over the dead animal and felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't random predation. This was a bear that had learned cattle were easy food, and a bear that had learned that lesson would keep coming back until it was stopped. He pulled out his phone and called Pratchett again, got voicemail, left a message describing the kill and requesting immediate assistance. Then he called the local RCMP detachment and spoke to Corporal Martinez, who listened with more sympathy than Pratchett had shown, but ultimately told Michael the same thing. Wildlife management was fish and wildlife's jurisdiction, and unless there was an immediate human threat, there wasn't much the police could do. Michael dragged the carcass away from the cache site and burned it in one of his brush piles, not wanting to leave anything that would keep drawing the bear back. The smoke rose black and greasy into the afternoon sky, and Magpie sat beside him with her ears back, whining softly in a way that said she didn't like any of this. Michael scratched behind her ears and told her it would be okay, but the words felt hollow even as he said them. That night, he loaded his rifle, a Remington 700 and 300 Win Mag that he'd owned since his 20s, and set it by the kitchen door where he could grab it fast. Linda saw him do it and didn't say anything, just put her hand on his shoulder for a moment before going back to preparing dinner. Pratchett finally showed up 4 days after the kill, driving a white Fish and Wildlife truck that looked like it had just come from the car wash. He was maybe 40, with a kind of soft physique that came from spending more time behind a desk than in the field, wearing a uniform that was spotless and pressed. Michael met him in the yard and walked him up to where the fence was down again, where the bear had pushed through the electric wire like it wasn't even there. Pratchett looked at the damage with his hands in his pockets, his expression bored. "Well, Mr. Chen, looks like you've got a persistent visitor, but I'm not seeing evidence of aggressive behavior toward humans. The fence damage is unfortunate, but it's not a justification for lethal removal." Michael kept his voice level. "Officer Pratchett, this bear has killed one of my animals and destroyed my fence twice. Under the Wildlife Act, I have the right to protect my livestock." Pratchett smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. "That's correct, Mr. Chen. You have the right to use reasonable measures to protect your livestock, which might include noise deterrence, lights, or electric fencing, which I see you've already tried. But lethal removal requires a permit, and I'm not prepared to issue one at this time. The bear hasn't shown aggression toward humans, and we have a responsibility to protect these animals." Michael felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. "So I'm just supposed to let it keep killing my cattle?" Pratchett shrugged. "I'm sure your insurance will cover livestock losses. The reality is, Mr. Chen, when you choose to ranch in grizzly country, you accept certain risks. These bears have as much right to be here as you do. More, actually, since they were here first." The casual dismissiveness of it, the smug certainty in Pratchett's voice, made Michael's vision narrow. "I've been ranching this land for 35 years. I know how to coexist with wildlife. But this bear's different. He's not moving on. He's learned to associate my property with easy food, and that makes him dangerous." Pratchett checked his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. "I'll make a note in your file, Mr. Chen. If the situation escalates, call us. But for now, my recommendation is to wait it out. The bear will den up soon, and this will be a non-issue." He turned and walked back to his truck, and Michael stood there watching him go, feeling something shift inside him that he didn't like. This wasn't about the bear anymore. This was about some government bureaucrat deciding that Michael's life's work, his family's legacy, was less important than checking boxes on a form. That evening, Linda found him sitting on the porch in the cold, staring out at the darkening mountains. She brought him a blanket and sat beside him, and for a long time, they didn't speak. Finally, she said, "What are you thinking?" Michael shook his head. "I'm thinking that man doesn't care if we lose everything. I'm thinking he looked at this ranch and saw an old Chinese man and an old woman, and figured we don't matter as much as his rules and regulations." Linda was quiet for a moment. "You think it's because we're Asian?" Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I think it's because we're old, and we're rural, and we don't have any power. Race probably doesn't help, but mostly, I think we're just not important enough to make a fuss over." Linda reached over and took his hand. "We could call Amy. She knows lawyers in Toronto. She could—" Michael cut her off. "Amy hasn't cared about this ranch since she left for university. She's not going to start caring now." That was harsh, and they both knew it, but it was also true, and Linda didn't argue. The bear came back 2 nights later. Michael heard the cattle bellowing, and was out of bed before he was fully awake, grabbing the rifle and running for the door. Linda was right behind him, calling for him to wait, to call Fish and Wildlife. But Michael was already outside in his long johns and boots, running across the yard toward the pasture. The moon was nearly full, turning everything silver and black, and he could see the cattle bunched up in the far corner of the field, see something massive moving between them and the fence. Magpie was barking frantically, running back and forth, but smart enough not to get too close. Michael raised the rifle, and then stopped, his finger on the trigger, but not pulling it. This was the moment. If he shot now, he'd be breaking the law. Pratchett would probably charge him, might even seize his livestock or shut down his operation. But if he didn't shoot, if he let this bear keep coming back, eventually someone was going to get hurt. The grizzly looked at him across 50 yards of moonlit pasture, and Michael could see the intelligence in its eyes. could see it calculating whether this human with the gun was worth the trouble. For a long moment they stared at each other, predator and defender, and then the bear simply turned and melted back into the timber, moving with shocking speed for something so massive. Michael stood there with his heart hammering, the rifle heavy in his hands, and realized he was shaking. Behind him, Linda reached the fence, breathing hard, and put her hand on his arm. "Michael, come inside, please." He let her lead him back to the house, but he kept the rifle with him, kept it loaded, and ready by the bed, where he could reach it in seconds. The next morning, Michael called his granddaughter, Sarah. She answered on the third ring, her voice hoarse with sleep, even though it was past 9 in Vancouver. "Grandpa, everything okay?" Michael sat at his kitchen table with coffee growing cold in front of him and told her everything. The bear, the kills, Pratchett's refusal to help, the confrontation the night before. Sarah listened without interrupting, and when he finished, there was a long pause. Then she said, "I'm coming up." Michael started to protest, started to say she didn't need to cut her recovery short, but Sarah cut him off. "Grandpa, I've been sitting around Vancouver for 3 months staring at walls and filling out disability paperwork. I need to get out of the city. I need to be somewhere that makes sense. And you shouldn't be dealing with this alone." Her voice softened. "Besides, I miss you guys. I miss the ranch. Let me come help." Sarah arrived 3 days later, driving a battered Ford F-150 that had seen better decades, wearing civilian clothes that hung loose on a frame that had lost too much weight. She hugged Michael and Linda with fierce intensity, and Michael felt her shake slightly in his arms. His granddaughter had always been tough, had joined the army at 18 against her mother's wishes, had thrived in the military in ways that Amy never could have understood. But Afghanistan had changed her, had put shadows in her eyes that hadn't been there before, and Michael recognized the look of someone who'd seen too much and was trying to figure out how to carry it. They sat in the kitchen drinking coffee, while Sarah asked detailed questions about the bear, about Pratchett, about the timeline of events. She had a small notebook, and she took notes, her handwriting neat and precise. And Michael was reminded that his granddaughter wasn't just a soldier. She was a military intelligence analyst who'd spent 3 years hunting Taliban cells through information and evidence. "So, this Officer Pratchett," Sarah said, tapping her pen against the notebook. "He's ignored multiple reports of livestock kills, refused to issue a permit for lethal removal, and basically told you to eat the losses. That sound about right?" Michael nodded. Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. "And you said he drives a brand new truck, has a pressed uniform, seemed more concerned with regulations than actually solving the problem." Michael nodded again. Sarah made another note. "Grandpa, I might be paranoid from spending too much time looking for insurgent patterns, but that doesn't sound like a lazy bureaucrat to me. That sounds like someone with a reason to want this problem to continue." Linda leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Sarah shrugged. "I don't know yet, but in my experience, when someone in authority refuses to do their job in a way that benefits someone else, there's usually a reason beyond simple incompetence. Give me a few days to look around, talk to some people. You'd be surprised what you can learn when you know where to look." Sarah spent the next week settling into her old room above the garage, helping with ranch work during the day, and spending her evenings on her laptop, making calls, reaching out to contacts from her military days who now worked in various government agencies. She was careful not to tell Michael and Linda exactly what she was doing, but Michael could see the intensity in her focus, the way she'd found a mission to replace the one she'd left behind in Afghanistan. The bear came back once during that week, killing another yearling and disappearing before anyone could respond. Michael found the kill at dawn, cached under branches again, and stood over it with a rage that felt like acid in his throat. This was his failing. He was supposed to protect these animals, this land, this life he and Linda had built. And instead, he was standing here, looking at another corpse, because some government officer had decided his rules were more important than Michael's reality. Sarah took photos of the kill from every angle, measured the tracks, collected samples of hair and scat in Ziploc bags, like she was processing a crime scene. "Grandpa," she said, crouched in the dirt, with her phone camera clicking. "How much do you know about the land west of your property?" Michael frowned. "It's all Crown land, part of the Forest Reserve." "Why?" Sarah stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Because I did some digging yesterday. There's a development proposal working its way through the provincial approval process. Company called Whitmore Developments wants to build a luxury resort community on 10,000 acres that borders your property. Golf course, private cabins, the whole 9 yards. The environmental impact study is still being completed, which means Fish and Wildlife has input on whether it gets approved. Michael felt something cold slide down his spine. You think Pratchett? Sarah held up a hand. I think Pratchett's father-in-law is Bradley Whitmore Sr., who owns Whitmore Developments. And I think your ranch, with its documented grizzly problems and livestock kills, makes a convenient argument against expanding human development in this area. Or conversely, if your ranch fails and gets sold, that's 1,200 acres that could be added to Whitmore's development proposal at a discount price. The implications of that settled over Michael like a weight. Linda had gone pale, her hand pressed to her mouth. They're trying to run us off our own land? Sarah shook her head. I can't prove anything yet, but the timing is awfully convenient, isn't it? You have grizzly problems for the first time in 15 years, right when there's a massive development proposal next door. Pratchett refuses to help, which means the problem continues and your losses mount. Eventually, you can't sustain the losses, and you sell, probably to the only buyer with pockets deep enough to afford 1,200 acres of prime land, Whitmore Developments, who then uses your property as part of their resort, removing any environmental objections because, hey, it was already a working ranch, right? Michael sat down heavily on the tailgate of his truck. That's conspiracy theory thinking, Sarah. That's saying they're actively trying to destroy our lives. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. Grandpa, I spent 3 years watching men blow themselves up for $20 and the promise of paradise. I've seen human beings do terrible things for reasons that make no sense to normal people. You think some rich developers sabotaging an old couple's ranch is beyond the realm of possibility? That's Tuesday for people like them. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He lay beside Linda in the darkness, listening to the wind and thinking about everything Sarah had said. It seemed impossible, seemed like the kind of paranoid thinking that came from watching too many movies or reading too much internet conspiracy nonsense. But then he thought about Pratchett's casual dismissiveness, his complete lack of interest in actually solving the problem, the way he'd looked at Michael and Linda like they were obstacles rather than people. He thought about big money and small-town corruption, about how many times he'd seen wealthy outsiders come into rural Alberta and act like they owned everything because they probably did. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe this wasn't about a bear at all. Maybe it was about 1,200 acres of land that someone else wanted badly enough to destroy everything Michael had built to get it. The next morning, Sarah drove into town to the regional office of Fish and Wildlife and asked to speak with Pratchett's supervisor. She was gone for 3 hours, and when she came back, her jaw was tight with anger. His supervisor's on extended medical leave. The acting supervisor's Pratchett, which means there's basically no oversight on his decisions right now. She slammed her truck door hard enough to make Linda jump. I also went to the county land office and pulled the development proposal documents. The environmental impact study specifically mentions grizzly habitat concerns, and guess who's listed as the primary wildlife consultant? Dean Pratchett. He's literally the person who decides whether the development is safe for bears, which means he has every incentive to keep bears alive and active in this area, regardless of what it costs local ranchers. Michael felt his hands start to shake. We need to go to someone higher up, the RCMP, the provincial government, someone. Sarah nodded. I'm already on it. I've got friends from the military who work in investigative journalism now. They're interested in the story. Corruption, conflict of interest, vulnerable elderly couple being railroaded by developers. But they need more evidence. We need to prove that Pratchett isn't just incompetent, that he's actively sabotaging your case. Over the next 2 weeks, as October turned to November and the first serious snows began to fall, Sarah built her case like she was conducting a military intelligence operation. She interviewed other ranchers in the area, found 3 who'd had similar problems with Pratchett. Reports ignored, permits denied, livestock losses mounting, while Fish and Wildlife did nothing. She documented the timeline of the Whitmore development proposal and matched it against the sudden increase in predator problems in the area. She found a conservation biologist who went on record saying that active grizzlies this late in the season were unusual and suggested someone might be interfering with their natural denning behavior. She pulled Pratchett's financial records, public information for a government employee, and found deposits and expenditures that didn't quite add up. Money flowing through his accounts that couldn't be explained by his salary. And through it all, the bear kept coming back. By the third week of November, Michael had lost 4 animals. 4 yearlings, over 2,000 pounds of beef, tens of thousands of dollars in losses that his insurance company was starting to balk at covering. The bear had gotten bolder, coming right up to the barn area, killing livestock within sight of the house. Michael had taken to sleeping in his clothes with the rifle beside the bed, had started walking the property at all hours, checking for signs of intrusion. Linda watched him run himself ragged and said nothing, because what was there to say? This was their life, and either they fought for it or they lost everything. Sarah worked her investigation with the focused intensity of someone who'd finally found a mission that mattered, who needed to prove that justice could still work when corruption tried to rig the game. On November 24th, 3 days before Thanksgiving, everything came to a head. Michael was in the barn doing evening chores when he heard Linda scream. Not a startled yelp, but a full-throated scream of pure terror that turned his blood to ice. He grabbed the rifle and ran, his 67-year-old legs pumping as fast as they could, bursting out of the barn into the yard, where the motion sensor lights had kicked on, turning everything stark and harsh. The grizzly was there, 30 feet from the house, standing on its hind legs with its head swinging back and forth. It was massive, bigger than Michael had thought, easily 500 pounds of muscle and teeth and claws. And Linda was on the porch, frozen in place, holding a bag of garbage she'd been taking to the bins when the bear appeared. Michael raised the rifle, sighted on the bear's chest, and screamed at Linda to get inside. The bear dropped to all fours and took 2 steps toward Linda, and Michael fired. The shot was deafening in the cold air, and Michael saw the impact, saw blood bloom across the bear's shoulder, but the animal didn't go down. It roared, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, and charged, not at Linda, at Michael, 700 pounds of apex predator covering ground with terrifying speed. And Michael worked the bolt and fired again, knowing he had maybe one more shot before those claws reached him. The second bullet caught the bear in the chest, and this time it stumbled, its front legs going out from under it. But it kept coming, crawling now, still trying to reach him, and Michael could see the fury in its eyes, the betrayal of an animal that had learned humans were easy prey and was now learning the terrible cost of that mistake. He fired a third time, and the bear finally stopped moving. The silence that followed was absolute, except for Michael's ragged breathing and Linda's sobbing from the porch. Sarah burst out of the garage, where she'd been working, took in the scene in one glance, and immediately pulled out her phone. "Don't touch anything," she said, already dialing. "Don't move the body, don't touch the rifle, don't do anything. I'm calling this in to the RCMP, not Fish and Wildlife. Corporal Martinez needs to see this exactly as it happened." Michael nodded numbly, his hands still shaking, the rifle barrel still smoking in the cold air. He looked at the dead bear, at the blood staining the snow, and felt nothing but a vast emptiness. This was what it had come to. An animal was dead because some corrupt bureaucrat had decided his payoff was more important than people's lives. Corporal Martinez arrived within 30 minutes, along with another RCMP officer and, inevitably, Dean Pratchett. Michael watched Pratchett's face as he took in the scene. The dead bear, Linda crying on the porch, Michael standing there with the rifle, and saw something like panic flicker across his features before he masked it with anger. "Mr. Chen, you've killed a grizzly bear without a permit. That's a criminal offense under the Wildlife Act. I'm going to have to seize your weapon and issue you a citation." Sarah stepped forward before Michael could respond. "Actually, Officer Pratchett, my grandfather was defending his wife from an immediate threat to human safety. That's explicitly legal under Section 74 of the Wildlife Act, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And before you try to claim otherwise, I've spent the last 2 weeks documenting your pattern of negligence and possible corruption. So maybe you want to think very carefully about what you say next." Pratchett's face went red. "I don't know who you think you are, but interfering with a fish and wildlife investigation..." Sarah cut him off, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I'm Master Corporal Sarah Chen, Canadian Armed Forces, Military Intelligence. I've spent 3 years investigating insurgent cells and corruption networks, and you're an amateur compared to what I'm used to. I have documentation of your financial ties to Whitmore Developments, your failure to respond to multiple livestock predation reports, and interviews with 3 other ranchers who've experienced the same pattern of negligence. I've also got a conservation biologist who's willing to testify that grizzly behavior this late in the season suggests human interference with their natural patterns. So here's what's going to happen. Corporal Martinez is going to take my grandfather's statement about this attack. You're going to write up your report, noting that the shooting was justified self-defense, and then you're going to recuse yourself from any further involvement with this case, pending an investigation by your supervisor. Or I can call the journalists I've been working with and have this story on the CBC tomorrow morning. Your choice. The silence stretched out, broken only by the wind and Linda's ragged breathing. Corporal Martinez looked between Sarah and Pratchett with the expression of someone who just watched a grenade get thrown into his quiet, rural policing career. Finally, Pratchett said, "You can't prove anything." Sarah smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "Actually, I can. I've got bank records showing regular deposits to your account from a shell company owned by Whitmore Developments. I've got emails between you and Bradley Whitmore Jr. discussing removing obstacles to the resort development. I've got testimony from a former fish and wildlife officer who says you bragged about making life difficult for ranchers who wouldn't sell. And I've got the incident reports from 3 other properties showing the same pattern: ignored complaints, denied permits, mounting livestock losses. Any one of those things might be coincidence. All of them together? That's a criminal conspiracy. What would you have done in that moment? Standing in the snow with a dead bear at your feet, watching everything you'd built hanging in the balance, would you have stayed quiet and hoped for the best? Or would you have fought back like Sarah did? Leave a comment below and let me know, because the next few minutes would determine whether justice would prevail or whether corruption would win, like it so often does in small towns, where money talks louder than right and wrong. Pratchett looked at Corporal Martinez, who was carefully not looking at anyone, his face neutral in the way of cops who know they're watching something way above their pay grade. Finally, Pratchett said, "I'll need to review the evidence." Sarah nodded. "You do that. In the meantime, my grandfather is protected by self-defense laws, and if you try to charge him or seize his property, I'll have the media here so fast you won't know what hit you. And just so we're clear, I've already shared copies of everything I've found with a lawyer in Calgary who specializes in government corruption. If anything happens to me or my grandparents, if we have any suspicious accidents, or if this ranch mysteriously burns down, all of that evidence goes public automatically. So everyone here needs to think very carefully about their next moves." Pratchett left without another word, his truck fishtailing in the snow as he drove away too fast. Corporal Martinez took statements from all 3 of them, his pen moving slowly across his notebook, and Michael could see the man was troubled by what he was hearing. When he finished, Martinez closed his notebook and looked at Michael with something like sympathy. "Mr. Chen, I want you to know that this will be investigated properly. The RCMP takes allegations of corruption seriously, especially when they involve threats to public safety. But I need to be honest with you, these things take time, and people with money have ways of making problems disappear. You might want to consider lawyering up, just to be safe." Sarah nodded. "Already done. We've got representation, and we've got media attention. This isn't going away quietly." The next few days were a blur. Sarah's journalist friends descended on the ranch, cameras and microphones and endless questions about the bear, about Pratchett, about the Whitmore development. The story went viral, elderly rancher and his military veteran granddaughter fighting back against corrupt government officials and greedy developers. David versus Goliath with a Canadian twist. The CBC ran it as their lead story for 2 days straight. Social media exploded with outrage, with calls for Pratchett's resignation, with demands that the Whitmore development be blocked. Michael found himself doing interviews from his kitchen table, Linda beside him holding his hand, trying to explain to cameras and reporters what it felt like to work your whole life building something only to have it nearly destroyed by people who saw you as nothing more than an obstacle to profit. The provincial government was forced to respond. Pratchett was suspended pending investigation. His supervisor was brought back from medical leave early, and a special investigator was appointed to look into Fish and Wildlife's handling of predator complaints in the region. The Whitmore development was put on hold pending environmental review, and Bradley Whitmore Sr. went on television to deny any wrongdoing, claiming the whole thing was a misunderstanding and his company had the utmost respect for wildlife and rural communities. Michael watched him lie with practiced ease and thought about how much damage men like that could do with a smile and a good lawyer. But something was shifting. Other ranchers came forward with their own stories of negligence and harassment. Environmental groups, who'd initially supported restricting development, started asking hard questions about whether Pratchett had manipulated data to make grizzly populations seem more robust than they actually were. The shell company that had been paying Pratchett was traced back through 3 layers of corporate structure to Whitmore Developments. And suddenly, there were forensic accountants involved, and tax lawyers, and criminal investigators. The whole rotten structure started to crack under scrutiny, and Michael watched with grim satisfaction as the people who'd tried to destroy his family began to face consequences for their actions. The investigation took 6 months. 6 long months of lawyers and depositions and court filings, of media attention that felt intrusive even when it was helpful, of living under the shadow of pending litigation while trying to keep the ranch running. Sarah stayed through all of it, helping with the cattle work during the day and coordinating with lawyers and journalists in the evenings. She moved through the work with the same focused intensity she'd probably brought to hunting Taliban, and Michael could see it was helping her heal, giving her a mission that made sense when so much of her life had stopped making sense. After Afghanistan, Linda worried about her, about the weight she wasn't gaining back, about the nightmares that sometimes woke her in the night, but Sarah just kept working, kept pushing, kept building the case that would bring down everyone who'd tried to break them. In June, the other shoe finally dropped. Dean Pratchett was arrested on charges of corruption, fraud, and criminal negligence. The evidence was overwhelming. The payments from Whitmore, the deliberately ignored predator reports, the manipulated environmental data. He'd been taking money for years, not just from Whitmore, but from other development companies, helping them navigate environmental regulations by either falsifying reports or making life miserable for landowners who stood in the way of projects. The conservation biologist Sarah had found testified that Pratchett had been using bait stations to keep bears active in specific areas past their normal denning times, creating ongoing predation problems that justified blocking development in some areas while arguing for it in others, depending on who was paying him. It was systematic, it was deliberate, and it had destroyed multiple ranching operations over the years. Michael's family had just been the ones who fought back. Bradley Whitmore Sr. and Jr. were charged with conspiracy and fraud. Their development company collapsed as investors fled and other projects faced renewed scrutiny. It turned out the Whitmores had been running similar schemes across Western Canada, using Pratchett and officials like him to manipulate land values and force sales through manufactured crises. The whole empire came down like a house of cards, and Michael watched it happen with a sense of vindication that felt good, but also left him vaguely unsettled. He'd wanted justice, not destruction. He'd wanted to protect his ranch, not become the catalyst for exposing a provincial corruption network. But Sarah reminded him that sometimes justice looked like destruction, that sometimes you had to tear down rotten structures completely before you could build something better. The trial was held in Calgary, and Michael and Linda drove down for the important days, sitting in the gallery watching lawyers argue over evidence and precedent. Pratchett's defense tried to paint him as a dedicated public servant who'd made some mistakes in judgment, but the prosecution had too much evidence, too many victims willing to testify. Michael took the stand and told his story. The ignored reports, the mounting losses, the night he'd had to shoot a bear in his own yard, while his wife screamed in terror. He looked at Pratchett while he testified, and the man couldn't meet his eyes. That felt important somehow, that moment of moral cowardice from someone who'd built a career on exploiting other people's vulnerabilities. The verdict came down in August. Pratchett was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 8 years in prison, plus restitution to the ranchers he'd harmed. Bradley Whitmore Sr. got 12 years. Bradley Jr., who testified against his father in exchange for a reduced sentence, got 5 years and a lifetime ban from working in real estate development. The judge's comments were scathing. She talked about betrayal of public trust, about the particular cruelty of targeting elderly rural residents, about how this kind of corruption poisoned communities and destroyed faith in institutions. Michael listened to her words and felt something in his chest finally loosen. some knot of anger and fear he'd been carrying for over a year finally starting to unravel. The ranch slowly returned to normal after that, or as normal as anything could be after everything they'd been through. Michael and Linda used the restitution money to rebuild their herd, to repair damage, to put some security in their retirement accounts. Sarah stayed through the summer and into the fall, and somewhere in that time, she seemed to find something like peace. She gained back weight, the nightmares came less frequently, and Michael caught her smiling again in ways that looked genuine. One evening in September, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains, and Sarah said, "I think I'm going to stay. Mom's going to have a fit, but I can't go back to the city. This place makes sense to me in a way nothing else does right now." Michael felt his throat tighten. "You sure? This is hard work, ranching. It's not romantic or noble, it's just work." Sarah nodded. "I know, but it's real work. It matters. And after 3 years fighting a war that maybe didn't matter as much as they told us it did, I need something real." The community rallied around them in ways Michael hadn't expected. Other ranchers who'd been victims of Pratchett's corruption formed a cooperative to share resources and information to make sure no one could be isolated and targeted the same way again. The new fish and wildlife officers were younger, hungrier, actually interested in doing their jobs right. The provincial government implemented new oversight regulations and ethics requirements, trying to prevent future corruption. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was better, and it came from the wreckage of what had almost destroyed Michael's family. A year after the trial, Sarah officially took over management of the Double C Ranch. Linda was slowing down, her arthritis making ranch work harder, and Michael's back wasn't what it used to be. Sarah hired 2 young ranch hands, both veterans from Afghanistan, who were struggling to find their place in civilian life, and together they built something that worked. The ranch became a kind of refuge for veterans dealing with PTSD and transition issues, a place where the work was hard but honest, and the landscape had a way of putting human problems in perspective. Michael watched his granddaughter turn his life's work into something that mattered beyond just cattle and grass, and he felt proud in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Amy came to visit, finally, 2 Christmases after everything had gone down. She stood in the kitchen where she'd grown up and looked at her daughter, scarred by war and corruption, but stronger for it, running a successful operation that was making a difference. And something shifted in her face. She apologized to Michael and Linda for staying away so long, for not understanding what they'd been trying to preserve, for not seeing the value in this life they'd chosen. It was awkward and uncomfortable and long overdue, but it was something. Sarah hugged her mother and told her it was okay, that everyone finds their path in their own time. And Michael thought about cycles of understanding and estrangement, and how sometimes it takes nearly losing everything to see what you actually have. Dean Pratchett served 4 years of his sentence before being released on parole. Michael heard about it through the victim's notification system and felt surprisingly little. The man was broken, his career destroyed, his family fractured, living in a small apartment in Edmonton and working retail to make his restitution payments. He'd lost everything that mattered to him, and while Michael believed in justice, he also believed in redemption if it was genuine. Pratchett had written a letter apologizing, and Michael had read it once and put it away. The apology might have been real, might have been self-serving, but either way, it didn't change what had happened. Some things you just had to carry. The Whitmores fared worse. Bradley Sr. died of a heart attack 2 years into his sentence, and Bradley Jr. became a cautionary tale about entitled rich kids who thought they could buy their way out of consequences. The family's wealth evaporated in legal fees and restitution. Their name became synonymous with corruption, and the legacy they'd tried to build turned to ash. Michael felt no particular satisfaction in their downfall. It was just the natural consequence of choices made, of systems held accountable, of justice working the way it was supposed to, even if it usually didn't. 3 years after the bear attack, Michael stood on his porch with coffee steaming in his hands, watching his granddaughter and her ranch hands move cattle across the south pasture. The mountains were pink and gold in the morning light, the air clean and cold, and everything was exactly the same and completely different. The ranch was safe, the land protected, the legacy secure. Sarah had brought in revenue streams he never would have thought of: agritourism, veteran programs, sustainable beef marketing. The operation was thriving in ways it hadn't in years, and Michael could step back knowing it would continue after he was gone. Linda came out and stood beside him, and they watched in comfortable silence as Magpie, old now and mostly retired, supervised from the porch steps. Michael thought about the bear, about Pratchett, about how close they'd come to losing everything. He thought about corruption and courage, about communities standing together against systems designed to grind them down, about how sometimes the only way to survive was to fight back with everything you had. He thought about his granddaughter who'd come home wounded from war and found healing in the land and the work and the mission of protecting what mattered. "What are you thinking?" Linda asked, the same question she'd asked 1,000 times over 42 years. Michael smiled. "I'm thinking about justice, about how rare it is and how good it feels when it actually happens, about how easy it would have been to give up, to just take the loss and move on. But we didn't. We fought, and we won, and that matters." Linda nodded. "Because of Sarah. She's the one who figured it all out, who put it all together." Michael shook his head. "Sarah helped, but it wasn't just her. It was all of us. It was the other ranchers who spoke up, the journalists who covered the story, the investigators who did their jobs right, the judge who took corruption seriously. One person can't fix a broken system, but a lot of people together working toward the same goal, that can change everything." So here's the lesson, the thing worth remembering from this story. Honor and integrity matter more than wealth and power, but only if people are willing to stand up and fight for them. Corruption thrives in silence, in the assumption that little people can't win against big money, in the belief that fighting back is too hard or too dangerous or too unlikely to succeed. Michael and Linda Chen were supposed to be easy victims, old, rural, without connections or resources. Dean Pratchett and the Whitmores were supposed to win because that's how the system usually works. But they didn't win because sometimes courage and community and refusing to back down is enough. Sometimes the system actually works if you push hard enough and refuse to let it fail. If this story moved you, if it made you think about corruption in your own community, or inspired you to fight back against systems that protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, then share it. Tell people about the Double C Ranch, about Sarah Chen and her grandparents, about what happens when ordinary people refuse to be victims. Hit that like button, subscribe to see more stories about justice and redemption. And remember that every tyrant, every corrupt official, every entitled bully is only powerful until people stand up and say no more. The ranchers won because they fought back. The question is, what are you going to do when it's your turn to stand? Michael finished his coffee and set the cup down, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in colors that seemed impossibly beautiful. He was 68 years old, his back hurt, his hands were arthritic, and he'd spent the last 3 years fighting battles he never should have had to fight. But he was still here, his family was safe, his land was protected, and justice, for once, against all odds, had actually prevailed. In the end, that was all anyone could ask for. Not an easy life, not a life without struggle or pain, but a life where courage mattered, and community counted, and standing up for what was right actually meant something. Michael Chen had been ranching this land for 36 years, and he figured he'd earned the right to believe that truth still mattered, that honor still counted, that sometimes the good guys actually won. The morning was cold and beautiful. His granddaughter was building something that would last, and in the end, that was enough. The icy wind carried the scent of death and terror, but Marcus Thornton Pierce didn't recognize it for what it was. His designer parka, custom ordered from a boutique in Manhattan for $3,000, rustled as he adjusted his Hasselblad camera, the latest model that cost more than most Alaskans earned in 6 months. His hands, manicured and soft despite his carefully cultivated, rugged explorer image, trembled slightly as he zoomed in on the dark opening between the rocks. Behind him, his wife Victoria fumbled with her own equipment, her breath coming in quick bursts that had nothing to do with the altitude. The den site was perfect, exactly what National Geographic would pay premium rates for, exactly what would cement their reputation as fearless wildlife photographers, willing to go where others wouldn't dare. What these arrogant outsiders didn't understand, what their expensive equipment and prestigious assignments couldn't teach them, was that some boundaries exist for reasons deeper than caution, that respect isn't something you can buy with a telephoto lens. and a corporate expense account. The massive shadow that detached itself from the darkness behind the den entrance moved with terrible purpose. And in that final moment, before everything changed forever, Marcus finally understood what the locals had been trying to tell him for weeks. But let me tell you something, and I want you to really think about this as we go through this story together. When you finish reading, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness is a tale of pride, prejudice, and the ultimate price of arrogance that everyone needs to hear. But let's rewind to where it all began, 3 months before that fatal October day when the first snow began to fall on Denali. Sarah Nakitak wiped down the counter at the visitors' center with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and precise. At 24, she had her grandmother's high cheekbones and her father's steady gaze, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity that came from knowing exactly who she was and where she came from. Her family had lived in these mountains for generations, long before the white settlers arrived with their maps and their markers, renaming places that already had names, drawing boundaries around land that had never belonged to anyone because it belonged to everyone. She wore her Park Service uniform with pride, even though the pay barely covered her student loans from the conservation biology degree she'd earned at University of Alaska Fairbanks, working 3 jobs throughout college, while her wealthier classmates partied and traveled. The early September morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made tourists gasp and reach for their cameras, and Sarah knew it would be busy. "Coffee's fresh," called Tom Whitehorse from the back office. Tom was 58, a veteran of Desert Storm, and 20 years with the Park Service, and he'd become something like a father figure to Sarah after her own dad passed away 5 years ago from a heart attack at just 52. Tom had served with her father in the Army, and when Sarah applied for the Park Service job, his recommendation had made the difference. "You're gonna need it today," got a call from headquarters. "Some hotshot photographers coming through. Got special permits from somewhere up the chain. The kind of permits that smell like political favors and corporate lobbying." Sarah poured herself a cup of the strong black coffee and frowned. "What kind of permits?" "The kind that let them get closer to wildlife than regulations normally allow. The kind that come with letters from senators and magazine editors." Tom emerged from the office, his lined face troubled. "Marcus and Victoria Thornton Pierce. You heard of them?" She had. Everyone in the wildlife photography world had heard of the Thornton Pierces. They were famous for their dramatic shots, the kind that showed predators mid-hunt, bears with salmon in their jaws, wolves surrounding prey. Their coffee table books sold for $150 each in museum gift shops. They appeared on talk shows and gave TED Talks about connecting with nature's raw essence. What they didn't mention in those talks was the trail of baited sites, disturbed dens, and stressed wildlife they left behind them. What they didn't acknowledge was that many of their most famous shots required approaching animals in ways that were either illegal or deeply unethical, sometimes both. "They're trouble," Sarah said quietly. "I saw them speak at a conference last year. They basically laughed at the idea of maintaining proper distance, said real artists have to be willing to take risks. Yeah, well, they're taking those risks in our park now, and somehow they got permits that override our standard protocols." Tom's jaw tightened. "I spent 20 years in the Army following orders, and another 20 here doing the same. But this feels wrong. These people, they don't respect the land. They don't respect the animals. And from what I hear, they sure as hell don't respect people like us." The visitor's center door opened with a blast of cold air, and a young couple entered, clearly tourists from the lower 48 by their brand new REI gear and slightly overwhelmed expressions. Sarah smiled warmly and greeted them, sliding smoothly into her role as guide and educator. She helped them plan their day, marked safe trails on their map, explained bear safety protocols that had been developed over decades of hard-won experience. These were good tourists, the kind who listened and nodded and asked thoughtful questions, the kind who understood they were visitors in someone else's home. Around noon, the Thornton Pierces arrived. Sarah heard them before she saw them, loud voices and expensive laughter carrying through the parking lot. They swept into the visitors center like visiting royalty, Marcus in the lead, with Victoria close behind. Both wore designer outdoor gear that probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months, the kind of clothing that was more about status than function. Marcus was tall and broad-shouldered, with the artificial tan of someone who spent time in exotic locations, but always had a first-class ticket home. His hair was perfectly styled in that calculated, rugged way that required a $100 haircut and expensive product. Victoria matched him in height and apparent expense, her blonde hair in an elaborate braid, her makeup subtle but clearly professional. "We're the Thornton Pierces," Marcus announced, not quite making it a question. "We have permits for extended wildlife photography. I assume you've been briefed?" Tom stepped forward, his military bearing evident. "Yes, sir. I'm Tom Whitehorse, Senior Ranger. This is Sarah Nakatak, one of our wildlife specialists. We'll need to review protocols with you before—" "We've been doing this for 15 years, Victoria interrupted, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We photographed grizzlies in Kamchatka, tigers in India, and leopards in Botswana. I think we can handle Alaska." There was something dismissive in her tone, something that suggested she found the very idea of rangers reviewing protocols with her vaguely insulting. Sarah stepped forward carefully. "I'm sure you're very experienced, but every environment has specific considerations. Our bear population here has particular patterns and sensitivities, especially this time of year as they prepare for winter. We've developed guidelines based on decades of observation and indigenous knowledge passed down." "Indigenous knowledge," Marcus repeated, and Sarah heard the quotation marks in his voice, the slight condescension. "That's charming, but we prefer to rely on scientific methodology and professional experience. No offense, but we've won 3 Kodak Awards and a National Magazine Award. Our work has been featured in every major publication. I think we know how to approach wildlife." Tom's expression hardened, almost imperceptibly, the kind of subtle shift that Sarah had learned to recognize from years of watching him deal with difficult visitors. "With respect, sir, awards don't mean much to a grizzly who thinks you're threatening her cubs. Sarah here has a degree in conservation biology and grew up in these mountains. Her grandmother was one of the most respected elders in the region, and her knowledge of animal behavior saved more than a few lives over the years." "I'm sure," Victoria said with a smile that felt like a pat on the head. "And we absolutely respect local traditions. But we're professionals, and we're working on a deadline. National Geographic is expecting our bear den documentation by November. We've got permits that authorize us to establish observation points closer than standard tourist distances. So if you could just show us the locations of active den sites, we'll be out of your hair." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "Den sites? You're planning to photograph bears at their dens? This time of year, they're preparing for hibernation. It's one of their most vulnerable and defensive periods. Approaching active dens is extremely dangerous, not to mention incredibly stressful for the animals." Marcus pulled out a folder of official-looking documents. "We have authorization from the Department of Interior, countersigned by the Alaska Wildlife Commission, and approved by your park superintendent. It's all here. Now, are you going to help us, or do we need to make some calls?" The threat was subtle, but clear. Sarah looked at Tom, who took the documents with obvious reluctance and scanned through them. His frown deepened with each page. "These are unusual. I'll need to verify these with headquarters." "You do that," Marcus said. "We'll be at the Denali Lodge, the suite, not the standard rooms. When you're done verifying, you can reach us there. We'd like to start tomorrow morning." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Sarah with an expression that might have been meant as friendly, but came across as patronizing. "I'm sure this is all very protective and territorial for you, being from here and all, but the world needs to see these animals. Our photography has raised millions for conservation. We're the good guys." After they left, Sarah stood in silence, her hands gripping the counter edge. Tom made his calls, verified the permits were legitimate, even if they stank of political influence, and then sat down heavily in his chair. 20 years, he said quietly. 20 years I've worked to protect this park, these animals, this land. And some rich photoga who probably never spent a night without climate control gets permits that override everything we've built. There has to be something we can do, Sarah said. Some regulation they have to follow, some oversight. There is, us. We can assign monitors, insist on ranger escorts, document everything they do. Make sure if they cross any lines, we have evidence. Tom looked up at her. You up for that? It means spending time with people who clearly don't think much of us. Means biting your tongue when they say ignorant things. Means watching them endanger themselves, and possibly animals, and only being able to intervene if they clearly violate their permits. I'm up for it, Sarah said. My grandmother used to say that the land provides teachers for those who refuse to learn gently. Maybe we can be the gentle teachers, and if they won't listen..." She left the thought unfinished, but they both knew what came next. The land had its own way of teaching hard lessons to those who refused wisdom. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with low clouds promising snow later in the day. Sarah met the Thornton Pierces at their vehicle, a luxury SUV rental that probably cost more per day than her monthly truck payment. She wore her full ranger gear, including her radio and emergency equipment, and carried a detailed map marked with current wildlife activity. Marcus looked annoyed to see her. "We don't really need a babysitter," he said. "Park policy for special permits," Sarah replied evenly. "I'm here to facilitate your work while ensuring compliance with wildlife protection regulations. I can also help you find the best vantage points for your photography while maintaining safe distances." "Safe according to whom?" Victoria challenged. "We've been charged by silverback gorillas. We've photographed feeding frenzies with great whites. We know how to read animal behavior and manage risk." Sarah didn't argue. Instead, she simply said, "It's non-negotiable. Either I accompany you, or the permits are suspended. Your choice." The tension in the vehicle during the drive was thick enough to cut. Marcus drove too fast for the conditions, and Sarah had to remind him twice about the speed limits, which weren't just arbitrary rules, but designed to prevent wildlife collisions. Each time, he slowed down with obvious irritation, muttering about bureaucracy and overregulation. They passed several other photographers along the roadside, tourists with long lenses photographing a bull moose near the tree line. The moose was a safe 200 yards away, and the tourists were being respectful and quiet. "Amateur hour," Victoria scoffed. "Look at them with their little zoom lenses. They'll go home with the same boring shots everyone else gets. That's not art, that's tourism. That's respect," Sarah said quietly. "That moose is undisturbed and can go about his day naturally. Those photographers will have images that capture authentic behavior, and they'll have them without causing stress or danger to the animal or themselves." "You sound like a textbook," Marcus said. "In the real world of professional photography, you have to be willing to push boundaries. That's how you get shots that matter, that make people feel something, that actually change minds and raise money for conservation." "In the real world," Sarah countered, her voice still calm, but with an edge now. "Pushing boundaries with wildlife gets people killed, and animals habituated to humans in dangerous ways. There's a reason we have these protocols. They're written in blood and hard lessons." They drove in silence after that, climbing higher into the mountains. Sarah directed them to an area where a sow grizzly and her 2 cubs had been spotted regularly over the past week, feeding on the last of the season's berries. It was a good spot for photography, with natural defilade that would keep them concealed and downwind if they were patient. But when they arrived and Sarah began explaining the approach, Marcus interrupted. "We're going to get closer. Those permits allow us within 50 yards of active wildlife. The permits allow it under specific conditions, with ranger approval, and only if the animal shows no signs of stress or defensive behavior," Sarah corrected. "We start at a safe distance and see how the bear responds to our presence. If she seems comfortable and unaware, we might be able to close distance gradually. But if she shows any signs of agitation..." "I've been reading bear behavior since before you were born," Marcus snapped, and Sarah noticed it was the first time he'd dropped the pretense of friendliness. His privilege was showing, the assumption that age and success meant automatic authority. "Victoria and I will make the call on what's safe. You're here to observe, not to dictate our artistic process." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling her grandmother's teaching settle over her like a warm blanket. Her grandmother had dealt with plenty of arrogant outsiders over the years, and she'd always said the same thing. Some people have to learn by falling. Your job isn't to catch them, it's to make sure they don't take others down with them. So Sarah documented everything with her own camera, noting times and distances in her field journal, recording GPS coordinates. She watched as Marcus and Victoria set up their tripods and began working, and she had to admit they were technically proficient. Their equipment was top of the line, their movements practiced and efficient. The sow appeared after about 40 minutes, ambling through the brush with her cubs tumbling after her. She was a beautiful animal, massive and powerful, her coat thick and glossy with the good feeding of late summer. The cubs were playful, wrestling with each other while their mother methodically stripped berries from branches. Marcus and Victoria began shooting immediately, their camera shutters clicking in a quiet mechanical rhythm. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then Marcus stood up. Sarah's hand went immediately to her radio. "Stay low," she said quietly. "Standing creates a larger profile. She hasn't noticed us yet." "I need a better angle," Marcus said, not quite whispering, but not speaking full volume either. "The lighting from here is flat. I'm moving 20 yards east." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Stay here. The wind is perfect right now. If you move, you'll change your position relative to..." But Marcus was already moving, and Victoria was following him. Sarah had no choice but to trail behind, documenting their violation of her explicit instructions. She radioed back to base, letting Tom know the situation was developing. The sow continued feeding, but one of her ears swiveled toward them. Sarah froze. Bears had incredible hearing, far better than their eyesight. The cub wrestling stopped, and both young bears looked toward their mother, reading her body language. Marcus was setting up his new position, oblivious or uncaring about the shift in the bear's behavior. He motioned for Victoria to go even further east, setting up for a cross-angle shot. They were now only about 60 yards from the bears, and Sarah could see the sow's head lift fully, her nose testing the air. The wind shifted, just slightly, and Sarah knew what was coming. The sow stood on her hind legs, rising to her full height of nearly 8 feet. It wasn't an aggressive posture yet, just investigative, but it was a warning sign that any experienced outdoors person would recognize. Marcus, incredibly, began photographing the behavior. "This is fantastic," he said, his voice carrying. "Victoria, are you getting this?" "Stop talking," Sarah hissed, "and start backing away, slowly, don't run." The sow dropped to all fours and huffed, a clear warning. The cubs moved behind her. She took 2 steps toward them, then stopped, huffing again. She was giving them every chance to retreat, showing remarkable tolerance considering they were near her cubs. Sarah began moving backwards slowly, not taking her eyes off the bear. "Move, now, back the way we came." Marcus finally seemed to grasp the situation. He grabbed his tripod, and the sudden movement triggered the sow's charge. It was a bluff charge, meant to scare them away, and she stopped after about 15 feet, woofing loudly and slapping the ground with her paws. But Marcus panicked. He turned and ran, the absolute worst thing you could do, and Victoria screamed. Sarah stood her ground, making herself large, speaking in a firm, calm voice. "Hey bear, we're leaving. No threat here. We're going." The sow stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah felt the full weight of that ancient intelligence assessing her. Then the bear turned, gathered her cubs, and moved away into the thicker brush, leaving them alive and unharmed, but thoroughly warned. Sarah's heart was pounding, adrenaline singing through her veins, but she kept her voice steady as she called the Thornton Pierces back. They emerged from behind a boulder where they'd taken shelter, Marcus's face red with anger and embarrassment. "That was unacceptable," he said. "You put us in danger with your hesitation. We should have retreated the moment I suggested moving." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "I told you not to move. I explicitly instructed you to stay low and quiet. You violated direct ranger orders, and you're lucky that sow was tolerant. A less experienced bear, or one with a different temperament, would have followed through on that charge." "I want to file a complaint," Victoria said, her hands shaking as she checked her camera equipment. "You're supposed to be facilitating our work, not preventing it with overly cautious protocols." "File whatever you want," Sarah said, her patience finally wearing thin. "I'll be filing my own report about your disregard for safety instructions and wildlife protection regulations. That bear was exhibiting clear stress behaviors before you moved, and I have it all documented. You were within seconds of being mauled, and it would have been entirely your fault." The drive back was silent and hostile. Sarah could feel their resentment radiating from the front seats, the wounded pride of people who'd been shown up by someone they considered beneath them. She'd seen it before, this particular combination of privilege and arrogance, the inability to accept that expertise might exist outside their narrow circle of approved credentials. When they reached the visitor's center, Marcus made good on his threat, spending 30 minutes on his satellite phone with what sounded like increasingly important people. Tom listened to Sarah's report with a grim expression, then reviewed her documentation. "You did everything right," he said. "Textbook response." The problem is, they've got powerful friends, and those friends are already calling the superintendent. I'm getting pressure to be more accommodating to their artistic needs. Accommodating. Tom, they almost got charged by a grizzly because they wouldn't listen to basic safety instructions. If I hadn't been there, if that bear had been less tolerant, we'd be dealing with a mauling at best, fatalities at worst. I know, but this is the world we live in. Money talks, and they've got a lot of it, and apparently a lot of connections. Tom rubbed his face tiredly. Do what you can to keep them safe and keep the animals safe. Document everything. And Sarah, watch your back. People like this, they're used to getting their way. When they don't, they get vindictive. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah's life became an exhausting exercise in patience and documentation. She accompanied the Thornton Pierces on 12 separate excursions, and each one reinforced her initial assessment of their character. They were technically skilled photographers, but terrible naturalists, more interested in getting dramatic shots than understanding or respecting the animals they photographed. They baited sites with food to attract bears, which was technically allowed under their special permits, but ethically questionable. They used drones despite Sarah's warnings about noise stress to wildlife. They ventured into areas that were closed to general public access, relying on their permits like shields against common sense. But worse than their environmental disregard was their treatment of people. Sarah watched them dismiss and belittle every local they encountered, from the lodge staff they ordered around, like servants, to the other rangers who tried to offer guidance. They made jokes about wilderness wisdom and noble savage stereotypes, just loud enough for Sarah to hear, but quiet enough to maintain deniability. They complained constantly about the food, the accommodations, the weather, the regulations, treating Alaska like a disappointing theme park rather than a living ecosystem deserving of respect. One afternoon, Sarah was having coffee at a small cafe in the park village when she overheard them talking to a journalist who'd come to do a profile piece. The biggest challenge isn't the wildlife, Marcus was saying. It's dealing with the local bureaucracy. These park rangers, they mean well, but they're so provincial in their thinking. They don't understand the bigger picture, the global impact of our work. We're trying to save these animals through our photography, and they're worried about staying 100 yards away. It's frustrating. The journalist nodded sympathetically. I imagine it must be difficult, being at the top of your field and having to take direction from, well, less experienced people. Exactly, Victoria agreed. We respect their local knowledge, of course. But there's a difference between knowing these mountains and understanding wildlife photography as an art form and conservation tool. Not everyone can see the forest for the trees, if you'll pardon the expression. Sarah set down her coffee cup carefully, willing herself not to react, but the journalist noticed her uniform and came over. Excuse me, are you one of the rangers working with the Thornton Pierces? I am. Sarah Nakatak, wildlife specialist. Would you like to comment on their work for the article? Sarah considered carefully. She knew anything she said could be twisted or used against her, but she also knew silence was complicity. The Thornton Pierces are very talented photographers. However, some of their methods push the boundaries of what we consider ethical wildlife interaction. Our protocols exist to protect both animals and humans, and they're based on decades of research and experience. I hope their final work will encourage readers to support conservation efforts, but I also hope it won't glorify the kind of close encounters that can be dangerous and stressful for wildlife. Marcus's expression hardened. That sounds like a veiled criticism. It's an observation, Sarah said calmly, based on 2 weeks of accompanying you in the field. After the interview was published, Sarah found herself called into a meeting with the park superintendent, a political appointee named Harold Jennings, who'd held the position for less than a year and had spent most of his career in Washington, D.C. offices rather than actual parks. He was polished and professional, but Sarah could tell immediately that he was more concerned with optics and powerful connections than with wildlife protection. Sarah, I've received several complaints from the Thornton Pierces about your conduct in the field. They say you've been obstructive, overly cautious to the point of interfering with their permitted activities, and that you made disparaging remarks to a journalist. Sir, I have detailed documentation of every excursion, including GPS data, timestamps, photographs, and written observations. The The Thornton Pierces have repeatedly violated safety protocols, disregarded direct instructions, and endangered both themselves and wildlife. My statement to the journalist was measured and factual. Nevertheless, perception matters. These are important people doing important work. National Geographic is the premier nature publication in the world. The publicity they're bringing to our park is invaluable. I need you to be more flexible, more collaborative. With respect, sir, I don't believe collaboration means abandoning safety standards or wildlife protection principles. Jennings sighed. Look, I understand you're passionate about this, but you need to pick your battles. The Thornton Pierces have permits signed by people well above my pay grade. They're here for another month, and then they'll be gone. Can you just try to make this easier on everyone? Sarah left the meeting feeling a familiar weight in her chest, the same weight she'd felt in college when professors dismissed her perspectives, or in graduate school when her research on indigenous wildlife management was called anecdotal, despite being based on centuries of careful observation. It was the weight of being told that her expertise, her knowledge, her very presence was somehow less legitimate than those with the right connections, the right credentials, the right skin color, or social class. That evening, she called Tom, who was on his day off. They got to Jennings, she said. He basically told me to back off and let them do whatever they want. Figures. Jennings is a politician, not a ranger. He cares about his next appointment, not about bears or integrity. Tom was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? My job. Keep them safe, keep the animals safe, document everything. What else can I do? You can remember that doing the right thing isn't always popular or easy. Your dad knew that. He stood up for his principles, even when it cost him. I served with men who gave everything for what they believed in. You come from that kind of stock, Sarah. Don't let these rich assholes make you doubt yourself. The next incident came during an excursion to a river valley where salmon were running late in the season and bears were taking advantage of the protein boost before hibernation. It was prime territory for photography, and Sarah had to admit the light was beautiful. The autumn colors reflected in the crystal water, the bears majestic as they fished. But it was also prime territory for conflict, with multiple bears in close proximity, all focused on feeding and preparing for winter. Marcus wanted to cross the river to get closer to a particularly large male who was dominating the best fishing spot. Sarah refused. That river is glacial melt. It's 40 degrees, the current is strong, and crossing puts us on an approach vector that could be read as threatening. We have excellent sight lines from this bank. You're not a photographer, Victoria said. You don't understand composition and angle. We need to be on that side for the light. And I'm telling you it's unsafe. You could be swept away by the current, develop hypothermia, or provoke a defensive reaction from the bears. The answer is no. Marcus made another phone call. 20 minutes later, Sarah's radio crackled with Superintendent Jennings's voice, instructing her to use reasonable judgment about the river crossing and to facilitate the Thornton Pierce's work. The message was clear: let them do what they want. Sarah watched as they prepared to cross, her stomach tight with dread. She documented everything, took photos of the river conditions, the bear positions, the time and temperature. She radioed for backup, getting confirmation that Tom was en route but was 30 minutes out. And then she did the only thing she could do. She crossed with them because if they got in trouble, someone needed to be there to help. The water was shocking even through her waders, the cold so intense it felt like knives. Marcus and Victoria struggled against the current, their expensive gear weighing them down. Halfway across, Victoria stumbled, and Sarah grabbed her arm, steadying her. They made it to the other side, but barely, and Sarah's legs were numb from the cold. They set up on a gravel bar that brought them within 40 yards of the fishing bears. It was closer than Sarah had ever been to multiple active grizzlies, and every instinct screamed danger. The big male they'd wanted to photograph was even more impressive up close, easily 800 pounds of muscle and power. He was focused on the salmon, but Sarah noticed his ears kept swiveling toward them, tracking their presence. Then, disaster. A younger male, maybe 5 years old and ambitious, approached the big bear's fishing spot. There was a brief confrontation, lots of posturing and bluff charging between the bears. And in the chaos of their conflict, they moved directly toward the gravel bar where the humans stood. Sarah grabbed both photographers and pulled them toward the tree line, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. Behind them, the younger bear, chased off by the dominant male, suddenly noticed their movement. He stood up, trying to understand what they were. Sarah put herself between the bear and the photographers, making herself large, speaking in a firm voice. "Hey bear, we're leaving. No food here. We're going." The bear dropped to all fours and took 2 steps toward them. Sarah pulled out her bear spray, flipped off the safety, but held her ground. "We're going, big guy. No trouble." For a terrible moment, the bear stared at her, and Sarah could see the calculation happening behind those small eyes. Then he huffed, turned, and loped away along the river. Sarah didn't move until he was completely out of sight. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline crash setting in. "That was incredible," Marcus said, his camera still raised. "Did you get that, Victoria? Did you get the stand-up?" "I got it. Oh my god, that was amazing. The light on his fur, the salmon in the background. This is going to be the cover shot." Sarah turned to stare at them. They were literally grinning, excited by the danger they'd just been in, already thinking about the awards and recognition they'd get for the shots. They hadn't processed that they'd nearly died, that Sarah had put herself in harm's way to protect them, that their reckless crossing had created a situation where multiple people and bears were endangered. They only saw the photographs, the glory, the professional triumph. "We're leaving," Sarah said flatly, "now, and we're not coming back to this location. But the light will be perfect for another hour. Now." Sarah's voice carried every ounce of authority she possessed. "That was unacceptable. You endangered yourselves, me and those bears. We're done here." The crossing back was even worse, with all of them fatigued and cold. Sarah went first, testing the depth and current, then helped each of them across. By the time they reached the vehicle, her teeth were chattering and her fingers were stiff with cold. Tom was waiting for them, his face grim. He'd heard Sarah's radio traffic about the close encounter, and Sarah could see the anger in his eyes as he assessed the situation. "Anybody hurt?" he asked. "No, but it was close. Too close." Tom looked at the Thornton Pierces. "I'm recommending your permits be suspended pending a safety review. What happened today was reckless and could have resulted in fatalities." "We had authorization from Superintendent Jennings to make that crossing," Marcus said. "Check your radio logs, and we completed our work without incident. If anything, your ranger here needs better training in managing her fear response. We were never in real danger." "You were in extreme danger," Tom said, his voice hard. "And you put Sarah in danger to clean up your mess." "I've been a ranger for 20 years and served in combat for 4 years before that. I know what danger looks like, and I know when civilians are too arrogant to recognize it." "Are you threatening us?" Victoria asked. "Because we have very good lawyers. I'm stating facts, and I'm making an official recommendation to suspend your permits." But the suspension never came. Instead, Sarah and Tom were called into another meeting, this time with Superintendent Jennings and a lawyer representing the Thornton Pierces. The lawyer presented a counter-narrative where Sarah had been overly reactive and had created panic where none was warranted, and where Tom was allowing personal biases to interfere with authorized activities. There were hints about discrimination lawsuits, about careers being damaged, about the Park Service's reputation. Jennings caved immediately. "The permits will remain active. However, Sarah, I'm reassigning you. Tom will take over as primary escort for the Thornton Pierces for the remainder of their time here. I think a fresh perspective will help everyone." It was a demotion, and they all knew it, a punishment for doing her job. Sarah kept her face neutral and accepted it, but inside, she felt something crack. Tom looked like he wanted to argue, but knew it would be futile. After the meeting, he followed Sarah outside. "This is wrong," he said. "Everything about this is wrong. But it's how things work, isn't it? People with money and connections get to do what they want, and people like us just have to watch and clean up after them." Sarah's voice was bitter. "My grandmother always said the land teaches its own lessons. Maybe that's what needs to happen here. Maybe they need to learn the hard way." "Don't say that. Don't even think it. We keep doing our jobs. We keep trying to protect them, even if they don't appreciate it. That's what honor means." And when honor isn't enough. Tom didn't have an answer for that. Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah watched from a distance as the Thornton Pierces continued their work with Tom as their escort. She heard the reports, saw the documentation, and recognized the same pattern of behavior, pushing boundaries, ignoring warnings, getting incrementally closer to more dangerous situations. Tom did his best, but he was one man dealing with 2 people who saw rules as suggestions and who had powerful protections. The park's other rangers gossiped about the situation. Some sided with Sarah, others thought she'd been too rigid. A few of the younger rangers looked up to the Thornton Pierces, impressed by their success and fame, eager to be associated with important people doing important work. Sarah kept her head down, focused on her other duties, and tried not to think about what might be coming. Then, in mid-October, the weather changed. A cold front moved in from the north, bringing early snow and dropping temperatures into the teens. Most of the tourists left. The park's wildlife began their final preparations for winter. The grizzlies, in particular, became focused on finding den sites, on preparing for the long sleep. It was the most dangerous time to approach them, when they were most defensive of their chosen locations, most likely to respond aggressively to perceived threats. The Thornton Pierces announced they'd found the perfect den site for their cover story. A pristine location with a sow and 2 cubs establishing their winter home. National Geographic had approved the concept, and the editors were waiting for the images. But getting the shots they wanted meant approaching within 20 yards of an active den with a mother and young during the period when she would be most protective. Tom came to Sarah's small office in the maintenance building. "They want to do it tomorrow. I tried to talk them out of it. I told them it was the single most dangerous thing they could do, but they have authorization from Jennings, and they're going forward with or without ranger escort. So you're going with them to try to keep them safe. What choice do I have? If I don't go, they'll just do it alone, and then nobody will be there if things go wrong. When, Tom? When things go wrong, not if." Sarah stood and looked out the window at the snow beginning to fall. "My grandmother used to tell me about the old days, before the park was established, before the tourists came. She said the bears and the people had an understanding, a balance. The bears would leave signs, warnings, and the people would read them and respect them. But then outsiders came who couldn't read the signs or wouldn't, and those people died, sometimes. And it was sad," she said, "but also necessary, because some lessons can only be taught one way." "Sarah, you're scaring me. What are you saying?" "I'm saying I won't be the one who has to watch them die. I'm saying I've done everything I can. We've both done everything we can, and they've rejected every warning. I'm saying that if they're determined to walk into danger, maybe that's what needs to happen for anything to change." "You don't mean that." But Sarah wasn't sure what she meant anymore. She was exhausted from fighting, from being dismissed and belittled, from watching people with power and privilege endanger themselves and others, while people like her were punished for trying to prevent disaster. She was tired of the weight of responsibility for people who mocked that responsibility. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her small apartment and thought about her father, who died too young from stress and overwork. She thought about her grandmother, who'd seen her traditional lands turned into a park, her knowledge dismissed as superstition, until it became profitable to market it as indigenous wisdom to tourists. She thought about Tom, a good man who'd served his country and dedicated his life to protecting wild places, now reduced to babysitting arrogant photographers who saw him as an obstacle rather than a resource. And she thought about the bears, who hadn't asked for any of this, who were just trying to survive and raise their young in an increasingly encroached upon world. Tomorrow, a mother bear would be approached at her den by humans who didn't understand or respect the boundaries of safety and propriety. That bear would have to make a choice: tolerate the intrusion or defend her cubs. If she tolerated it, photographers would learn that the warnings were overblown, that the rangers were just being cautious, that the real way to get great shots was to ignore the rules. If she defended herself, people might die. It was an impossible situation, and Sarah realized that she'd been put in an impossible situation from the start. The system had failed. The regulations meant to protect both people and wildlife had been overridden by wealth and connections. And now, the land itself would have to do the teaching that human institutions couldn't or wouldn't do. She got up, made tea, and opened her laptop. She began writing a detailed account of everything that had happened over the past month. Every violation, every warning ignored, every time the Thornton Pierces had endangered themselves or others, every time Superintendent Jennings had prioritized political connections over safety. She documented the phone calls, the meetings, the lawyers' threats. She compiled her field notes, her photographs, Tom's reports, everything that would be needed if, when, something terrible happened. Because Sarah understood something the Thornton Pierces didn't. She wasn't trying to control them, or limit their art, or jealously guard her provincial little territory. She was trying to prevent them from walking into a situation that would end in tragedy. And if they insisted on walking into that tragedy anyway, then at minimum, there should be a clear record of why it happened, and who bore responsibility. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the new snow in shades of pink and gold, Sarah watched from her window. Somewhere out there, a grizzly mother was settling into her den with her cubs, preparing for winter, trusting in the ancient rhythms of hibernation. And somewhere out there, 2 photographers were preparing to violate that sacred space, convinced that their talent and their permits made them exempt from the laws of nature. Sarah said a quiet prayer, one her grandmother had taught her, asking the land to be merciful but just, asking the bears to protect themselves and their young, asking forgiveness for what she could not prevent. Then she finished her documentation, saved it in multiple locations, and sent copies to her personal email and to a trusted journalist friend who worked for a conservation magazine, insurance, just in case. Tom called at 7 a.m. They want to leave at 9. The weather is supposed to clear this afternoon. Give them good light. This is it, Sarah. Last day of their permit period. After today, they're done and leaving Alaska. Be careful, Tom. Please, be careful. Always am. And Sarah, thank you for trying, for caring. Whatever happens, know that you did everything right. Sarah spent the morning in the visitors center, unable to focus on anything. Every car that passed, every radio call made her jump. She organized files that didn't need organizing. She cleaned equipment that was already clean. She drank too much coffee and couldn't eat the sandwich she'd packed. Other rangers noticed but gave her space, recognizing that she was dealing with something heavy. At noon, Tom radioed in. We're on site, establishing observation point, weather holding clear for now. At 12:30, another radio call. They're setting up equipment, den entrance is visible. No bear activity visible yet. At 1 p.m., Tom's voice came through tighter, stressed. They're moving closer. I've advised against it, but they're insisting. They want the angle showing the den entrance with the mountain in the background. We're at about 30 yards now. At 1:15, Sarah heard what she'd been dreading. Tom's voice, urgent but controlled. Bear is emerging. Repeat, bear is emerging from den. The sow is aware of our presence. She's standing, assessing. I'm recommending immediate withdrawal. Then, garbled, over the sound of shouting. They're not listening. Stay back. Get behind. Then nothing. Radio silence. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to raise Tom. No response. She tried again. Nothing. She immediately called for emergency response, dispatched for helicopter evacuation, and began pulling on her gear. Another ranger, Jake, grabbed her arm. Wait, you don't know what's happening. Let the emergency team. That's Tom out there, and 2 civilians, whatever I think of them. I know that area. I'm going. The drive to the den site location took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah drove too fast, pushed the vehicle harder than she should have, her mind racing through scenarios and emergency protocols. She was still 15 minutes out when the radio crackled again. This time, it was Tom's voice, hoarse and shaken. Multiple casualties. Repeat, multiple casualties. I need immediate medical evacuation. Both photographers are down. Injuries are severe. I'm injured but mobile. The bear has retreated into the den. We are not in immediate danger but need evac now. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She coordinated with dispatch, confirmed the helicopter was en route, pushed her vehicle even faster. When she arrived at the staging area, she grabbed a first aid kit and ran the half-mile to the den site, her breath burning in the cold air. The scene was carnage. Marcus was on the ground, his expensive parka shredded, blood soaking through in multiple places. Victoria was a few yards away, not moving, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. Camera equipment was scattered everywhere. Thousands of dollars of gear broken and trampled. and Tom sat on a rock, holding his arm at an odd angle, his face gray with pain, but his eyes alert. Jesus, Tom, what happened? They wouldn't stop. I told them. I physically tried to stop them. But they pushed past me, got within 15 yards of the den entrance. The sow came out fast. She was defending her cubs. She knocked Marcus down first, mauled him. Victoria tried to run, and the bear caught her. I got between them, and the bear used the bear spray, finally drove her back, but not before. He gestured at the wounded. Sarah immediately began triage. Marcus was conscious but in shock. Deep lacerations on his arms and torso where the bear's claws had connected. Victoria was unconscious, probably a concussion in addition to the leg injury. Sarah worked with practiced efficiency, applying pressure to wounds, stabilizing Victoria's neck, keeping both victims warm while they waited for the helicopter. The sound of rotors filled the valley. The helicopter landed in a clear area 50 yards away, and paramedics rushed forward with stretchers. Sarah briefed them quickly on the injuries and what had happened. They loaded both photographers and Tom, who tried to protest but was clearly going into shock himself. "I'm staying," Sarah told him. "Someone needs to document the scene and make sure that bear isn't disturbed further." Tom nodded weakly. "It wasn't her fault. The bear. She was defending her cubs. Make sure everyone knows that." "I will. I promise." After the helicopter lifted off, Sarah stood alone in the blood-stained snow. She documented everything with her camera and detailed notes. The positions where the victims had fallen, the distance from the den entrance, the scattered equipment, the bear tracks showing how the attack had unfolded. She found Marcus's camera, still functioning, and checked the memory card. The last photos were of the den entrance, taken from absurdly close range. Then photos of a massive grizzly charging directly at the camera. The final image was blurred, taken as the camera fell or was knocked away. She secured the site, marked it clearly with warning signs, and radioed for additional rangers to maintain a safety perimeter. Then she hiked back to her vehicle and drove to the hospital in Fairbanks, a 3-hour drive that she made in under 2.5. Tom was in surgery for his arm, which had been broken in 2 places when the bear knocked him down. Marcus was in critical condition, with massive blood loss and potential internal injuries. Victoria was stable, but would need multiple surgeries on her leg. Sarah sat in the waiting room, still in her blood-stained uniform, and began making phone calls, first to Superintendent Jennings, who answered with his politician's voice, and immediately began asking about liability. Sarah cut him off. 2 people are in critical condition because they ignored safety protocols, overrode ranger recommendations, and approached an active bear den despite explicit warnings. I have comprehensive documentation of every warning they received, every protocol they violated, and every time they were given the chance to do the right thing. This is on them and on everyone who enabled them. Now, Sarah, let's not be hasty about assigning blame. I'm not assigning blame, I'm stating facts. Facts that are documented, time-stamped, and backed up in multiple locations. Facts that I'll share with any investigation, any reporter, any legal proceeding. These people had every advantage: permits, equipment, expertise, warnings. They chose to ignore all of it, and a good man who was trying to protect them is in surgery because of their arrogance. She hung up on his sputtering response and called the journalist friend she'd sent her documentation to. It happened. Everything I warned about. It's time to tell the story. Over the next few days, the story broke in waves. First the local news, reporting the bear attack and the injuries. Then the national news, because the Thornton Pierces were famous enough that their misfortune was newsworthy. Then the deeper stories, as journalists began requesting records and interviewing rangers. Sarah's documentation became the backbone of a narrative that went far beyond a simple animal attack. It became a story about privilege and consequences, about systems that protected the wealthy and connected at the expense of everyone else. It became a story about indigenous knowledge versus colonial arrogance, about respecting nature versus exploiting it for profit and glory. It became a story about the rangers who tried to prevent tragedy, and the administrators, who ignored their warnings. The journalist Sarah had contacted wrote a long-form piece for Outside magazine titled, "The Price of the Perfect Shot: How Privilege and Arrogance Nearly Killed Two Photographers." It included excerpts from Sarah's documentation, quotes from Tom and other rangers, analysis of the permits that had been issued, and the political connections that secured them. It included photos from the scene, with Sarah's permission, showing the scattered equipment and blood-stained snow. But it also included something else: the final photos from Marcus's camera, showing exactly how close they'd gotten, how clear the warnings should have been. The magazine ran one of these photos, a shot of the den entrance from perhaps 12 yards away, with a caption. This photograph was taken moments before photographer Marcus Thornton Pierce was mauled by a defensive mother grizzly. Despite repeated warnings from park rangers, including indigenous wildlife specialist Sarah Nakitak, the Thornton Pierces approached an active den site with cubs, violating both common sense and ethical wildlife photography standards. The reaction was swift and polarized. The photography community split between those who defended the Thornton Pierces' artistic vision and those who condemned their methods. Wildlife organizations issued statements about ethical photography. The Park Service launched an investigation into how the permits had been issued. Environmental groups called for stronger protections for denning bears. And internet commenters, as always, had opinions ranging from thoughtful to vicious. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Would you have kept trying to protect people who didn't respect your expertise? Where's the line between duty and enabling dangerous behavior? Think about that as we continue. Marcus survived his injuries but required multiple surgeries and months of physical therapy. Victoria's leg required titanium rods and would never fully recover. Tom's arm healed, but he took early retirement 6 months later, tired of fighting battles where politics mattered more than principles. Superintendent Jennings was quietly reassigned to a desk job in Washington, his failure to support his rangers' safety recommendations now a permanent mark on his record. The Thornton Pierces tried to control the narrative, giving interviews where they presented themselves as victims of an unpredictable animal attack, as artists who'd suffered for their craft. But every interview was met with rebuttals from rangers, from wildlife biologists, from indigenous leaders who'd been warning about this kind of arrogance for generations. Their carefully cultivated image as fearless conservationists crumbled, replaced by a new reputation as cautionary tales. National Geographic pulled their contract, stating that the methods used to obtain the den photographs violated the magazine's ethical guidelines. Other publications followed suit. The Thornton Pierces' speaker fees dried up. Their coffee table books were remaindered. They tried to sue the Park Service for failing to protect them, but Sarah's documentation and Tom's testimony made that case impossible. They tried to sue Sarah personally for defamation, but truth is an absolute defense, and every statement she'd made was backed by evidence. In the end, they settled for selling their story to a tabloid television show, appearing broken and humbled, warning other photographers not to make their mistakes. It was a far cry from TED Talks and National Geographic covers, and everyone who'd known them recognized it as the ultimate humiliation for people who'd built their identity on being at the top of their field. But the real reckoning came in other ways. The Alaska Wildlife Commission revoked the special permit program that had allowed the Thornton Pierces close approaches, implementing new regulations that gave rangers final authority over safety decisions, regardless of political pressure. Indigenous advisory councils were established at all major Alaskan parks, ensuring that traditional knowledge would be incorporated into management decisions. And funding was increased for ranger training and support, recognizing that frontline staff needed backing from their superiors. Sarah received recognition from wildlife organizations, conservation groups, and indigenous leadership councils. She was invited to speak at conferences, to train other rangers, to write about her experiences. But what mattered most to her was simpler. She kept her job. She'd protected the bear who was just defending her cubs, and she'd stood up for principles even when it was hard. The mother bear and her cubs survived the winter in their den, undisturbed after the attack. Sarah checked on them the following spring, watching from a respectful distance as the sow emerged with her cubs, teaching them to forage and hunt. The bear showed no unusual wariness or aggression. She was just a bear being a bear, doing what bears had done in these mountains for thousands of years before humans arrived with cameras and permits. Tom came by Sarah's office one afternoon, about 8 months after the attack. His arm was still in a brace, but he was smiling. Heard you're teaching a course on wildlife ethics at the university next semester. Yeah, they asked if I'd do a guest lecture series. Figured I have some relevant experience. Sarah smiled back. How are you doing? Good, better. My daughter's getting married next month in Seattle. I'll walk her down the aisle with my bad arm, but I'll walk her. Could have been worse. Could have been much worse. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Tom said, "You know what your grandmother would say about all this? About how it played out? Probably that the land provided the teaching when the teachers were ignored. That nature has a way of enforcing its own boundaries when humans forget where those boundaries are. Smart woman, your grandmother. We should listen to people like her more often. People are starting to, slowly. It's not perfect, but it's better than it was. That's all we can ask for, I suppose. Progress, not perfection." Tom stood to leave, then paused. "You did good, Sarah. Your dad would be proud. I'm proud." After he left, Sarah sat looking out her window at the mountains. The summer tourists were back, keeping their distance, following the rules, listening to ranger guidance. The bears were fishing and eating berries, raising cubs, preparing for another year. The land continued its ancient cycles, indifferent to human drama, but always ready to teach those willing to learn. Sarah thought about the story that was still being told, about the Thornton Pierces and their fall from grace, about the reforms that had come from tragedy. She thought about how a system that protected the privileged had been forced to change when that privilege collided with natural consequences. She thought about all the people over the years who tried to warn arrogant outsiders and been dismissed, and how finally, one story had broken through. But she also thought about redemption, because that mattered too. Victoria Thornton Pierce had reached out a month ago, asking to meet. They'd had coffee in Fairbanks, and Victoria had been different. Humbled, reflective, genuinely remorseful. She'd admitted that she and Marcus had been arrogant, that they'd dismissed Sarah's expertise, because they couldn't imagine that someone younger, indigenous, and less famous could know more than they did. She'd apologized, not with the careful language of lawyers, but with genuine emotion. "I can't walk without a cane," Victoria had said. "I'm in pain every day. My career is over. And you know what? I deserved it. Not the pain maybe, but the consequences. We were wrong. We were so wrong. And if I could go back and listen to you, really listen, I would, but I can't. All I can do is try to make sure other people don't make our mistakes." Victoria had started teaching photography at a community college, emphasizing ethics and responsibility. She'd written a book, not about her famous photographs, but about her failure, titled "The Cost of Arrogance, A Photographer's Confession." She donated her speaking fees to wildlife conservation and indigenous education programs. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was something. It was accountability and attempted redemption. Marcus had been less forthcoming, still trying to rebuild his reputation, still giving interviews where he was more victim than villain. But even he had stopped approaching wildlife closely, stopped pushing boundaries, stopped dismissing local knowledge. Fear, if not wisdom, had changed his behavior. And perhaps that was the point of the whole story. Change came through consequences. The system hadn't protected the vulnerable or the voiceless until protecting them became unavoidable. The privileged hadn't respected boundaries until violating boundaries carried undeniable costs. It was a hard lesson, bought with blood and pain, but it was a lesson that stuck. Sarah's grandmother had told her once, "The land doesn't judge, it just is. It sets the rules of living here, and if you follow those rules, you can thrive. If you ignore them, you suffer. That's not cruelty, that's just truth." And that was what had happened on that October day, when a mother bear defended her cubs from intruders who wouldn't respect her space. Not cruelty, just truth. The fall semester started at the university, and Sarah stood in front of 40 students in Wildlife Ethics 301. She told them the story, not sparing details or softening edges. She showed them the documentation, the photos, the evidence of warnings ignored and consequences delivered. She made them grapple with hard questions about privilege and power, about whose knowledge counts and whose gets dismissed, about systems that protect the wrong people and leave others vulnerable. "The question I want you to take from this class," she told them, "isn't whether you can do something. With enough money and connections, you can get permits and access to almost anything. The question is whether you should. Whether your goals, however worthy you think they are, justify the risks you're imposing on others, human and non-human others." whether your individual achievement matters more than collective safety and respect for the natural world. One student raised his hand. But don't we need people who push boundaries? Who take risks to get the shots that make people care about conservation? There's a difference between courage and recklessness, Sarah answered. Courage is taking calculated risks with full knowledge and preparation, accepting personal consequences for personal choices. Recklessness is ignoring expertise, dismissing warnings, and endangering others while assuming you're special enough that normal rules don't apply. The Thornton Pierces weren't courageous, they were reckless, and other people paid prices for their recklessness. Another student asked, "Do you think the bear should have been killed? Isn't that usually what happens after an attack?" That bear was defending her cubs in her den. She did exactly what any mother should do when someone threatens her children. Killing her would have been punishing her for our failure to keep dangerous humans away from her. Fortunately, the investigation made it clear that the humans were at fault, and the bear was just being a bear. She lived, her cubs lived, and they're still out there. That's how it should be. At the end of the semester, students presented projects on ethical dilemmas in wildlife management and conservation. They wrestled with questions that had no easy answers, learned to see multiple perspectives, developed frameworks for making responsible decisions. Some would go on to be rangers, biologists, photographers, policymakers. All of them would carry forward the lessons of what happens when arrogance meets consequences. 2 years after the attack, Sarah was promoted to lead wildlife specialist for Denali National Park. Tom, officially retired but unable to stay away completely, volunteered as a mentor for new rangers. The special permit program remained reformed, with strong protections for both wildlife and ranger authority. And the story of the Thornton Pierces became a case study in universities, photography schools, and ranger training programs across North America. The story's moral was simple but powerful. Respect has to be earned by everyone, not just demanded by those in power. Expertise exists in unexpected places, and dismissing it because it doesn't come with the right credentials or social status is not just arrogant but dangerous. Nature sets boundaries that wealth and connections cannot override. And sometimes, the only way systems change is when the consequences of protecting privilege become too costly to ignore. Sarah still visited her grandmother's grave regularly, leaving offerings of tobacco and sweet grass, telling her about the changes that had come, thanking her for the wisdom that had sustained her through difficult times. She'd found her way to honor both her heritage and her professional calling, to be a bridge between traditional knowledge and modern conservation, to protect the land and creatures that had sustained her people for generations. On quiet mornings, she'd sometimes drive to the area near that den site, now permanently closed to photography and marked with signs explaining why. She'd watch the mountains turn golden with dawn light and remember that terrible day. She'd remember Tom's courage, Victoria's current attempts at redemption, Marcus's failure to truly learn. She'd remember the bear, powerful and protective, doing what nature demanded, and she'd think about all the young people she was training, all the rangers she was mentoring, all the future conflicts that might be prevented by the lessons learned in blood and pain. She'd think about her father and grandmother, about the long line of her people who'd lived in these mountains and learned their truths. She'd think about justice, which came slowly and imperfectly, but came nonetheless when good people refused to stop fighting for it. The land continued its cycles, indifferent to human drama, but always instructive for those willing to learn. Bears denned and emerged, salmon ran, seasons turned. And in the middle of it all, people like Sarah stood guard, protecting boundaries, sharing knowledge, trying to prevent the next tragedy while knowing they couldn't prevent them all. That's the story. A story about pride meeting nature, about privilege colliding with consequences, about systems being forced to change when they can no longer protect the powerful from the results of their own arrogance. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about how we treat expertise, how we respect nature, how we decide whose knowledge matters, then share it. Let it reach others who need to understand that true strength isn't dominating others or pushing boundaries for personal glory. True strength is protecting the vulnerable, respecting boundaries, and having the humility to listen to those who know better than you do. regardless of their credentials or social status. Like this content if you believe expertise should be respected, regardless of where it comes from. Subscribe if you want more stories about justice, consequences, and the importance of honoring both nature and knowledge. And comment below with your thoughts. Have you ever tried to warn someone who wouldn't listen? What happened? How do we build systems that protect everyone, not just the privileged and connected? Remember, every boundary exists for a reason, every warning comes from experience, and every expert deserves respect, regardless of their background. The land teaches its lessons to everyone equally. The only question is whether we're humble enough to learn before those lessons become painful. That mother bear is still out there, raising her cubs, living by ancient rules that predate human arrogance. She did nothing wrong. She was just being what she was meant to be. The humans who suffered, they made their choices. And in the end, justice came not from courts or institutions, but from the simple truth that nature doesn't care about your credentials, your connections, or your fame. It only cares whether you respect its boundaries. That's the lesson, that's the truth, and that's why this story matters. The wooden gavel struck 3 times against the polished surface, each crack echoing through the Helsinki courtroom like thunder rolling across the Finnish wilderness. And Christian Virtanen's face drained of all color as the judge pronounced the sentence that would strip away everything he'd built on the broken backs of desperate workers. His hands trembled as they reached for the brass buttons of his expensive Armani suit, the same hands that had signed documents condemning workers to unsafe conditions, the same hands that had shredded safety reports and paid off inspectors, now shaking with the knowledge that 7 years in Riihimäki prison awaited him, along with fines that would bankrupt his berry empire forever. The gallery erupted in applause, and several seasonal workers wept openly, their faces marked by years of exploitation, finally seeing justice delivered. And among them sat a woman whose scarred face told a story of survival that had brought this moment to pass. Her right eye socket empty beneath a medical patch, her jaw reconstructed with titanium plates, but her remaining eye burning with quiet satisfaction as the man who had almost killed her was led away in handcuffs. But what these arrogant exploiters of the working poor didn't know when they sent their seasonal pickers into unmapped bear territory without safety equipment or proper training was that one survivor would possess not just the will to live through 30 minutes of playing dead beneath a brown bear's claws, but also the methodical patience of a woman who'd spent 56 years learning that justice moves slowly, but arrives inevitably for those who refuse to be silenced. Subscribe now to witness how one woman's refusal to accept a settlement offer transformed into a legal avalanche that buried an entire corrupt industry beneath the weight of its own crimes, exposed a network of officials who valued profit over human life, and rewrote Finnish labor law to protect the most vulnerable workers from the predators who wore suits instead of fur. But let's rewind to where it all began, to a June morning in 2014, when the midnight sun hung perpetually in the northern sky, and the forests of Lapland promised abundance to those desperate enough to harvest it. Sanna Virtanen woke at 4 in the morning in the cramped worker dormitory that smelled of mildew, instant coffee, and the collective exhaustion of 30 other seasonal berry pickers who traveled from all corners of Finland and beyond for the promise of summer wages. She moved quietly through her morning routine, careful not to wake the Thai woman sleeping in the bunk above her, a grandmother named Prani who'd flown 6,000 kilometers because berry picking in Finland paid more than she could earn in 2 years back home. The wooden floor creaked under Sanna's feet as she pulled on her worn work clothes, cargo pants with reinforced knees that she'd patched herself 3 times, a long-sleeved thermal shirt despite the summer warmth, because the mosquitoes in the forest would devour any exposed skin, thick wool socks that had belonged to her late husband Mikko, dead 5 years now, from the lung cancer that took so many men from the paper mills. She braided her gray-blonde hair into a tight plait that hung down her back, splashed cold water on her face from the communal sink where rust stains marked decades of use, and studied her reflection in the cloudy mirror for just a moment, seeing the lines that 56 years of hard work had carved around her eyes and mouth, the permanent furrow between her eyebrows from squinting against sun and snow, the capable hands with their short, practical nails, and the small scar on her left thumb from a fish hook when she was 7 years old. The kitchen held the same breakfast it held every morning, porridge made from the cheapest oats, weak coffee, and hard bread that you could soften in the coffee if you had patience. Sana ate standing up, her body already calculating the day ahead, the kilometers she'd walk through the forest, the kilos of berries she'd need to pick to make her daily quota, the money she'd send to her daughter Alina, who was studying nursing in Tampere and working 2 part-time jobs that still weren't enough to cover rent and textbooks. This seasonal work was brutal on the body, but it was honest, and the forest had always felt like home to Sana, who'd grown up in a small village where her father had been a hunting guide, and her mother had taught her which plants healed and which ones killed, how to read the forest's moods and respect its ancient rhythms. She'd worked in a grocery store for 23 years after Miko got sick, had taken care of him through the worst of it, had held his hand when he died, and afterward found that the walls of the store's fluorescent aisles felt like a coffin compared to the breathing space of the wilderness. So 3 summers ago, she joined the seasonal pickers, the marginalized army of workers who followed the berry harvests from south to north, trading comfort for cash and the freedom of working under open skies. The transportation truck arrived at 5:30, a battered vehicle with wooden benches in the back where workers sat squeezed together, 30 bodies swaying with each pothole on the rough forest roads. Sana sat near the back next to Juko, a 62-year-old former construction worker whose knees were so damaged he could barely climb stairs anymore, but could still crouch for hours, picking cloudberries and lingonberries with the patient efficiency of someone who'd learned to work through pain. They didn't speak much during these rides, both conserving energy for the day ahead, but there was comfort in companionship, in knowing someone else understood the particular exhaustion of this work. The truck drove deeper into the wilderness, past lakes that reflected the pale morning sky like sheets of hammered silver, through forests of pine and spruce where the trees grew so thick that the ground remained perpetually shadowed and carpeted with moss and lichen, along rutted paths that were barely roads at all, just tracks carved by logging vehicles and worn deeper by years of use. The driver, a taciturn man named Petri who worked for the berry company and seemed to view the workers with the same indifference he showed the cargo, finally stopped at a drop point marked only by orange tape tied around several trees. The workers climbed down from the truck bed, collecting their equipment from the storage bins, plastic buckets, and canvas bags, and the specialized berry rakes that looked like small metal hands designed to strip berries from their branches efficiently. The supervisor for this sector, a sharp-faced woman named Lena, who wore a company vest and carried a clipboard like a weapon, called out assignments and territory divisions, her voice cutting through the morning air with bureaucratic precision. Each picker received a designated area marked on crude hand-drawn maps, sections of forest that they were expected to harvest thoroughly before moving to the next zone, and their output would be weighed at day's end with deductions for any leaves or unripe berries mixed in with the harvest. Lena emphasized the quotas, as she always did, her tone making clear that falling short meant reduced pay or replacement with one of the hundreds of other desperate workers waiting for positions. Sana took her map without comment, noted the coordinates, and set off into her assigned territory with the steady gait of someone who'd learned to pace herself for a 12-hour day. The forest swallowed her within minutes, the sounds of other workers fading. As she pushed deeper into the undergrowth following the landmarks on her map, she moved through the terrain reading it like text, noticing the slope that indicated water drainage, the moss growth that showed the direction of prevailing winds, the animal tracks pressed into soft earth near a stream, moose prints and smaller marks that might be fox or marten. The cloudberries grew in the boggy areas where the ground was wet and unstable, each golden orange berry like a cluster of tiny gems that commanded premium prices in the markets. And Sana's territory included several promising bogs, according to her map. She found the first patch within an hour, dropped to her knees in the soggy earth that immediately soaked through her pants, and began the meditative work of picking, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency, selecting only the ripe berries and leaving the unripe ones for future harvest, dropping them into her bucket with soft plinking sounds that created a rhythm to work by. This was where Sana found her peace, in the solitary focus of the work, in the smell of peat and pine, in the cry of birds overhead and the buzz of insects around her head, in the knowledge that she was doing something real and tangible, providing food that people would eat, earning money honestly through her own labor, She thought about Elena while she worked, pictured her daughter bent over anatomy textbooks in her small apartment, imagined the day when Elena would graduate and wear the white uniform of a registered nurse, breaking the cycle that had kept their family locked in working-class poverty for generations. Miko would have been so proud, would have cried those rare tears he saved for moments of overwhelming emotion, and Sana carried that future pride like a talisman against the aches in her knees, and the mosquito bites on her neck, and the exhaustion that settled into her bones like sediment. She worked through the morning as the sun climbed higher, though in this northern latitude during summer, the sun's position barely changed, circling the sky in its endless dance above the horizon. She moved from bog to bog, following her map, filling bucket after bucket, and by noon, she'd harvested nearly 15 kilos of cloudberries, good progress that put her on track to exceed her quota. She ate her lunch sitting on a fallen log, dark rye bread with cheese and a thermos of coffee, allowing herself 20 minutes of rest while her body complained about being still after hours of movement. The forest around her was alive with activity if you knew how to notice it. The chitter of a red squirrel in the canopy, the rustle of smaller creatures in the undergrowth, the distant sound of a woodpecker attacking a dead tree with mechanical precision. Sana closed her eyes for a moment and let the forest sounds wash over her. Let herself feel the contentment that came from honest exhaustion and meaningful work, from being exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. But there were other sounds in the forest that afternoon, sounds that she noticed but didn't immediately recognize as warning signs. The crack of branches being pushed aside by something large, the grunt that might have been territorial marking or simple movement, the rustle of vegetation that indicated an animal trail she hadn't mapped yet. She continued working through her assigned sectors, moving steadily through the afternoon hours, and it was nearly 4 o'clock when she crested a small ridge and saw below her a bog thick with cloudberries, more than she'd seen all day, a golden carpet that would help her exceed her quota significantly and earn bonus pay that she could send to Elena. She descended the slope carefully, her boots slipping slightly on the moss-covered rocks, and reached the bog's edge where the cloudberries hung heavy on their low plants, so ripe they were almost falling off, and she thought how perfect the timing was, how lucky she was to have this sector today. She was on her knees in the soft earth, both hands working steadily, her bucket already half full, when she heard the sound that stopped her heart, a woof of breath and the unmistakable crack of something large moving through vegetation directly behind her. Sana froze completely, every muscle locking, her father's voice echoing from childhood lessons about forest safety, about the brown bears that roamed these territories and could be curious or territorial or protective of food sources they considered theirs. She didn't turn her head, didn't make eye contact, didn't run, though every instinct screamed at her to flee, because she knew that running triggered chase instinct, and that no human could outrun a bear that could hit 40 kilometers per hour in seconds. Instead, she slowly began to lower herself toward the ground, making herself small and non-threatening, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat and her ears and her fingertips. And she heard another woof, closer now, and the wet sound of breathing, and the sharp animal smell that hit her nostrils like a physical blow. The bear was massive. She saw in her peripheral vision as it moved into her field of view, easily 300 kilos of muscle and fur and claws, its brown coat thick and healthy, its small eyes fixed on her with that flat animal intelligence, that calculated threat and food and territory. It approached the cloudberry patch that Sana had been harvesting, began eating the berries with casual efficiency, its massive head lowering to strip them from the plants, and Sana remained frozen in her half-crouch, barely breathing, counting seconds and praying that the bear would eat its fill and move on, that she was in no way threatening or interesting enough to provoke an attack. But the bear finished with the berries in front of it and turned its attention to Sana's bucket, the plastic container filled with cloudberries that represented hours of work and desperately needed money, and it moved toward her with terrifying speed, covering the distance in 2 strides that shook the ground beneath her. Sana made the decision in a fraction of a second, released the bucket, and rolled away from it, giving the bear what it wanted, but her movement was too fast, too sudden, and the bear interpreted it as either threat or fleeing prey. And suddenly, 300 kilos of apex predator was lunging at her with explosive power, hitting her like a car crash and driving her backward into the bog's soft earth. She felt the impact crush the air from her lungs, felt claws like knives tearing through her clothing and into her flesh, felt teeth close on her face with pressure that made her skull feel like it would shatter, and the pain was white-hot and total and overwhelming. But underneath the pain was the training her father had given her, the knowledge that her only chance was to play dead completely, to become a non-threat, to let the bear dominate her without resistance. She went limp even as the bear shook her like a dog worrying a toy, even as she felt her cheekbone crack and her eye socket collapse and her jaw dislocate. Even as blood poured from wounds she couldn't catalog, she forced every muscle to relax and hung in the bear's grip like a corpse. The bear dropped her, and she fell into the bog's cold water, face down, and she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't react as the bear's massive paws pressed against her back and its claws raked down her spine, testing for response. She felt the bear's hot breath on her neck, felt it bite down experimentally on her shoulder with enough pressure to crack bone but not break through, felt it roll her over, and she kept her eyes closed and her body completely slack, a rag doll, a dead thing, nothing worth attacking further. The bear woofed again, the sound vibrating through her damaged body, and she heard it moving away, heard it return to the cloudberries, heard it feeding with the casual sounds of an animal that had eliminated a threat and could now eat in peace. 30 minutes passed while Santa lay motionless in the cold bog water, her face submerged except for her nose, which she kept barely above the waterline, breathing in tiny, shallow sips of air that her damaged ribs could manage, and every second felt like drowning, and every second felt like salvation, because each second meant she was still alive. The silence eventually told her the bear had gone, the absence of feeding sounds and movement, but she waited another 10 minutes before she dared to move, to lift her head from the water with agonizing slowness, to assess the damage that pain had only hinted at. Her face was ruined. She could tell by touch, and by the way vision was gone in her right eye, just darkness and the wet feeling of blood still flowing, and her jaw wouldn't close properly, and when she tried to speak to test if she could call for help, only a gurgling moan emerged from her destroyed mouth. She couldn't stand, discovered that her left leg wasn't responding correctly, saw the tears in her clothing and the deep wounds where claws had carved through muscle, and the rational part of her brain that had kept her alive during the attack now calculated her chances of survival and found them poor. She was kilometers from the drop point, had no radio because workers weren't issued communication equipment, had no way to signal for help, and the truck wouldn't return until 6 o'clock, more than an hour away, and even then would only wait 30 minutes before leaving anyone who didn't show up. Company policy to maximize efficiency, Santa began crawling, dragging her damaged body through the bog toward higher ground, leaving a trail of blood in the water behind her, her working arm pulling her forward, while her damaged leg trailed uselessly and pain screamed through every nerve. She focused on the mechanics of movement, blocked out the fear and the pain and the knowledge that she might bleed out alone in this forest where her body might not be found for days, focused only on reaching the next rock, the next tree, the next meter of ground. She'd survived 56 years of poverty and hard work and loss, had nursed her husband through his death, had raised a daughter alone, had worked jobs that destroyed her body, for wages that barely covered rent, and she would not let a bear end her story in this bog, would not let Alina receive a phone call about her mother dying alone and undiscovered in the wilderness. She crawled for what felt like hours, time losing meaning in the haze of pain and shock, and eventually reached the slope she'd descended earlier, began pulling herself up it using tree roots and rocks, her blood painting the moss and leaves, her breath coming in ragged gasps that rattled in her damaged chest. She made it to the ridgetop as the sun finally began its shallow descent, and she could see in the distance through her remaining eye the orange tape marking the drop point where the truck would arrive. Still kilometers away, but visible, a destination, and she crawled toward it with the stubborn determination of someone who'd learned that survival wasn't about strength or speed, but about refusing to quit when quitting would be so much easier. Workers found her 300 meters from the drop point, her body finally giving out as loss of blood and shock-overwhelmed will, and the last thing she remembered before unconsciousness took her was Zuko's weathered face above her, his rough hands pressing his shirt against her wounds, his voice calling for help in the frantic tone of someone who'd seen death enough times to recognize its approach, and the taste of blood and bog water, and the bitter knowledge that the forest she loved had nearly killed her. What Sana didn't know during her emergency helicopter evacuation to Ulu University Hospital, didn't know through the 14 hours of surgery where teams of doctors reconstructed what the bear had destroyed, didn't know through the medically induced coma that followed, was that her attack wasn't random chance or the simple misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The territory she'd been assigned was part of a new sector that Christian Virtanen's company, Nordic Berry Enterprises, had opened just 3 weeks earlier, expanding into unmapped wilderness to meet the growing demand for wild Finnish cloudberries in international markets, where they sold for premium prices, golden treasure from the pristine Nordic forests, marketed to wealthy consumers who paid €20 for a jar of jam and never thought about the hands that picked the berries or the bodies that broke harvesting them. The expansion had been rushed through without proper environmental surveys, without wildlife assessments, without the safety protocols that Finnish law required for commercial operations in wilderness areas, because Christian Virtanen had political connections that mattered more than regulations and profit margins that couldn't wait for bureaucratic delays. Christian Virtanen was 48 years old and looked like success, his face tanned from tennis club sessions rather than outdoor labor, his body maintained by a personal trainer and kept slim by portion-controlled meals prepared by his wife, who'd given up her own career to manage his household and raise their 3 children, who attended private schools in Helsinki. He wore suits that cost more than his seasonal workers earned in a month, drove a Range Rover that was replaced every 2 years, and lived in a lakeside villa where he entertained ministers and corporate executives on his private dock while discussing business over dinners that could feed a family for a week. He'd inherited the berry company from his father, who'd built it from nothing after the war, but where his father had known every picker by name and treated them like extended family, Christian viewed labor as a resource to be exploited efficiently, numbers on spreadsheets that needed to be optimized, costs that needed to be minimized to maximize the returns that funded his lifestyle. The morning after Sana's attack, Christian sat in his office in downtown Helsinki, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, and received the phone call from his operations manager about the incident. He listened with the detached interest of someone hearing about a problem that required management rather than concern, asked about liability exposure and insurance coverage, and whether production quotas had been affected, made notes on his tablet about implementing a revised incident protocol. When his manager mentioned that the injured worker was in critical condition and might lose an eye, possibly die from her injuries, Christian's response was to ask whether they'd secured a signed liability waiver from her when she was hired, and when told they had, he visibly relaxed and moved on to discussing berry yields in other sectors. He instructed his legal team to prepare a settlement offer capped at €15,000 plus medical expenses, an amount he calculated would be too tempting for a working-class woman to refuse, even if she initially considered legal action, and he specifically told them to emphasize the difficulty of proving company negligence and the expense of litigation that could drag on for years while she had medical bills mounting. But Christian Virtanen didn't know Sana, didn't understand the particular stubbornness of someone who'd survived poverty and loss and 30 minutes under a bear's claws, didn't realize that there were people for whom principles mattered more than money and justice mattered more than comfort. He also didn't know that among the seasonal workers who'd witnessed Sana's rescue, who'd seen her destroyed face and blood-soaked clothing, was a retired police officer named Heikki Laaksonen who'd taken berry-picking work to supplement his pension and pass time after his wife died, a man who'd spent 35 years learning how to spot criminal negligence and document evidence, and who'd recognized immediately that sending workers into unmapped bear territory without safety equipment or wildlife training wasn't an accident but criminal recklessness. Heikki visited Sana in the hospital 3 weeks after her attack, when she was conscious but still heavily bandaged, still in pain despite the medications, still trying to process what had happened to her body and her face and her future. He sat beside her bed and spoke in the gentle tone of someone who delivered bad news to families countless times, told her what he'd learned about the company's expansion into the new territory, about the absence of required wildlife surveys, about the way safety reports had been filed retroactively and backdated to create the appearance of compliance. He told her about other workers who'd complained about bear sightings in the new territories, complaints that had been dismissed by supervisors who were under pressure to meet quotas. And he told her that he believed what happened to her was the predictable result of corporate negligence that put profit above worker safety. He offered to help her build a case if she wanted to pursue justice, told her it would be difficult and lengthy, and that companies like Nordic Berry Enterprises had expensive lawyers and political connections, but that he believed she had a strong case, and that someone needed to stand up before another worker was killed. Sana looked at Heike with her remaining eye, the other socket still covered by bandages that would come off soon to reveal the permanent damage, the empty space where her right eye had been before the bear's teeth destroyed it beyond any possibility of saving. She thought about the settlement offer that Christian Virtanen's lawyers had already presented, 15,000 euros that could pay off Alina's student debts and cover medical expenses not handled by insurance, money that would make both their lives significantly easier. She thought about how much simpler it would be to take the money and move on, to accept that the attack was just bad luck, misfortune, the risk you accepted when you worked in the wilderness. But she also thought about her father, teaching her about respecting the forest, about how bears weren't evil creatures, but wild animals following their instincts, and that humans who invaded their territory without proper precautions were the reckless ones. She thought about Miko on his deathbed, making her promise to never let anyone push her around, to always stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. She thought about Alina and the world her daughter would work in, whether it would be a world where companies could maim workers and buy their silence cheaply, or a world where the powerful faced consequences for their negligence. Sana told Heike she wanted to fight, and she asked him what she would need to do, and he smiled the tired smile of someone who'd expected that answer and respected it deeply. They began building their case that very day, with Heike's pension funding copies of documents and filing fees, while Sana focused on her recovery and rehabilitation, learning to navigate the world with monocular vision, enduring multiple surgeries to reconstruct her jaw and cheekbone, sitting through psychological counseling sessions about trauma and survival and the nightmares that came every night where she relived those 30 minutes in the bog water. Heike tracked down other seasonal workers who'd been in the new territories, gathered statements about bear sightings and the lack of safety briefings, obtained internal company emails through contacts who still worked in government oversight offices, built a timeline that showed Nordic Berry Enterprises had known about the bear presence, and chosen to minimize it because stopping operations would cost money. The company's lawyers initially dismissed Sana's case as frivolous, a standard workplace incident covered by insurance and release agreements, but their tone changed when Heike presented documentation showing that required environmental surveys hadn't been completed before workers were sent into the new territories. They offered to increase the settlement to 25,000 euros if Sana would sign an NDA and agree not to speak publicly about the incident. And when she refused, they went to 35,000, then 50,000, each increase making it clearer that they were afraid of what public exposure would reveal. Christian Virtanen personally called Sana after the 50,000 euro offer was rejected, his voice dripping with false concern as he told her he wanted to do right by her, that he felt terrible about what happened, that the company would take care of all her needs if she would just be reasonable and accept that accidents happen in dangerous work environments. Sana listened to his smooth voice, his practiced sympathy, and she thought about the Range Rover he drove, and the villa he lived in, and the private schools his children attended, all built on the broken bodies of workers like her, who had no choice but to take dangerous jobs for survival wages. She told Christian Virtanen that she would see him in court, that she wanted the truth exposed publicly, that she wanted laws changed so no other worker would be sent into bear territory unprepared. And she hung up on him while he was mid-sentence, a small victory that made her smile despite the pain in her reconstructed jaw. The satisfaction of that moment carried her through the following months of preparation, through the discovery process where Nordic Berry Enterprises tried to bury them in paperwork, through the depositions where company executives claimed ignorance of basic safety requirements, through the moments when she questioned whether one working-class woman could really take down a wealthy corporation with political connections and unlimited legal resources. The case gained attention when a journalist from Helsingin Sanomat wrote about it, framing the story as a David versus Goliath battle between a disfigured berry picker and a corporate giant that valued profits over people. The article included a photograph of Sana taken 6 months post-attack, showing her scarred face and empty eye socket before the prosthetic was fitted, and the image was visceral enough to cut through the usual public apathy about workplace safety. Comments poured in on the newspaper's website and social media, thousands of people expressing outrage about the conditions that seasonal workers endured, sharing their own stories of exploitation and negligence. And suddenly Sana's case became a symbol of the larger battle between labor and capital, between the vulnerable and the powerful, between those who did the work and those who profited from it. What would you have done in her position? Would you have taken the easy money, or stood up for principle knowing the fight would consume years of your life and reopen your trauma repeatedly in courtroom testimony? Christian Virtanen felt the tide of public opinion turning against him and responded the way powerful men often do when challenged, with aggression and intimidation disguised as legitimate business tactics. He had his lawyers file counterclaims against Sana, alleging that she'd violated safety protocols by entering a restricted area, a complete fabrication since her assignment map clearly showed she was exactly where she'd been ordered to work. He used his connections to have favorable articles planted in business publications that framed him as an entrepreneur under attack from opportunistic plaintiffs exploiting the legal system. He had his company's HR department send letters to all current seasonal workers, reminding them that discussing ongoing litigation violated their employment contracts and could result in termination, a clear attempt to intimidate potential witnesses. He even tracked down Sana's daughter, Elina, and had one of his representatives approach her outside her university with an offer of a full scholarship and guaranteed job placement after graduation if her mother would drop the lawsuit, crossing a line that revealed his desperation and willingness to use any lever available. Alina told her mother about the approach, and Sana felt rage like she'd never experienced before, not even during the bear attack, because threatening her was one thing, but involving her child was a violation that demanded response. She gave an interview to the same journalist who'd written the original article, detailing the intimidation tactics and the attempted bribery of her daughter, and the story went viral beyond the Finnish media, picked up by international outlets that covered labor rights and corporate accountability. Suddenly, Christian Virtanen was facing scrutiny, not just from domestic public opinion, but from international consumers who bought Nordic berry products and didn't want to support a company that maimed workers and then tried to silence them through intimidation. Sales dropped as major retailers responded to social media campaigns demanding they stop carrying Nordic Berry Enterprises products, and Christian watched his profit margins collapse along with his reputation. He made more mistakes in his panic, tried to have Heike investigated for improper use of his former police credentials to obtain documents, an accusation that backfired when it was revealed that all documents had been legally obtained through proper channels, and Christian's attempt to investigate the investigator looked like more intimidation. He gave an interview where he claimed that seasonal workers accepted the risks of wilderness work and shouldn't expect luxury hotel safety standards in the forest, a statement so tone-deaf and callous that it became a meme on social media and was played repeatedly on news programs as evidence of corporate arrogance. He tried to settle again, this time offering 300,000 euros and a public apology, but Sana refused because the case had become bigger than just her compensation. It was about changing the system that allowed companies to treat workers as disposable resources. The trial began in January 2016, 18 months after the attack, in a Helsinki courtroom packed with journalists and labor advocates and former seasonal workers who'd come to witness justice being pursued. Christian Virtanen sat at the defense table flanked by 4 lawyers, whose combined hourly rate exceeded what Sana had earned in a year of berry picking, and he projected an aura of injured innocence, a successful businessman being unfairly persecuted by someone who wanted to blame her own bad luck on corporate deep pockets. His lawyers were aggressive during opening statements, painting Sana as an experienced wilderness worker who'd failed to follow basic safety protocols, who'd gotten too close to a known bear feeding area, who was now trying to leverage a tragic accident into a massive payday through emotional appeals and media manipulation. They showed graphs of the company's safety record, pointed out that thousands of workers had harvested berries safely in their operations, suggested that holding Nordic Berry Enterprises responsible for a wild animal attack was like suing a landlord because a tenant was struck by lightning. Sana sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a simple dress and no makeup, the scars on her face visible to everyone in the courtroom, her prosthetic eye removed to show the empty socket that the bear's teeth had created, letting the jury see the full reality of what Christian Virtanen's negligence had cost her. Her lawyer, a labor rights specialist named Antti Mäkinen, who'd taken the case pro bono because he believed in its importance, methodically presented evidence showing that Nordic Berry Enterprises had rushed expansion into the new territory to meet international demand, that environmental surveys required by law hadn't been completed, that workers had reported bear sightings that were dismissed by supervisors, that Christian Virtanen himself had signed documents approving the territory's use despite lacking required safety certifications. Antti called expert witnesses who testified about brown bear behavior and how predictable it was that competition over food sources would lead to aggression, about how proper protocols would have included wildlife surveys, bear awareness training for workers, emergency communication equipment, and designated safety zones that workers could retreat to if they encountered dangerous animals. Heikki testified about his investigation, presenting a damning timeline that showed Nordic Berry Enterprises had prioritized speed and profit over worker safety at every decision point. He revealed internal emails where Christian Virtanen had pushed operations managers to increase quotas and expand territory despite concerns about wildlife, where he'd specifically overruled recommendations to delay expansion until proper surveys were completed, where he'd calculated that paying occasional injury settlements was cheaper than implementing comprehensive safety protocols. The emails were devastating, showing in Christian's own words his view of workers as expendable resources and his willingness to accept casualties as a cost of doing business, and his lawyers visibly deflated as the evidence mounted because there was no way to spin those communications as anything other than criminal negligence. Former workers testified about the culture of intimidation within the company, how complaining about safety concerns resulted in reduced assignments and blacklisting, how workers were told repeatedly that they were replaceable, and if they didn't like the conditions, they could quit and starve. Prani, the Thai grandmother who'd slept in the bunk above Sana, testified through a translator about how she'd seen bears in her assigned territory and reported it to her supervisor, who told her the bears were more afraid of her than she should be of them, and to just make noise while she worked. Juko testified about finding Sana barely alive, and how there was no emergency communication system despite the remote location, how he'd had to carry her 300 meters to where cell service was available before he could call for help, how she would have died if he hadn't happened to be nearby when she collapsed. Each testimony added another weight to the scales of justice, and the jury listened with the horrified attention of people realizing that the comfortable products they bought came with hidden costs paid in blood by vulnerable workers. Christian Virtanen's lawyers tried to shift blame, calling witnesses who testified about Sana's experience in wilderness work, and suggesting that meant she should have known better than to enter a bear feeding area. But Antti destroyed that argument by showing that Sana had followed her assignment map exactly, that she'd been sent into that bog by company orders, that her experience made her more cautious, not less, that she'd survived the attack only because she'd had the knowledge and discipline to play dead perfectly for 30 minutes. The defense tried to argue that bear attacks were inherently unpredictable and that no amount of safety protocols could prevent them, but environmental experts testified that proper surveys would have identified the bear population in the area and that established protocols existed for working in bear habitat that Nordic Berry Enterprises had simply ignored. The defense tried to minimize the severity of Sana's injuries, suggesting that modern medical care had addressed most of the damage, and Antti responded by having Sana remove her prosthetic eye in the courtroom and turn her ruined face toward the jury, asking if they thought 15,000 euros was adequate compensation for being disfigured for life, because a wealthy man didn't want to spend money on safety measures. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the evidence was overwhelming. But the real turning point came when Christian Virtanen took the stand in his own defense against his lawyer's advice, apparently believing his charm and success would win over the jury. Auntie Mäkinen cross-examined him with surgical precision, walking him through the decision-making process that had led to Santa's attack, getting him to admit that he'd approved the territory expansion, that he'd been told surveys were incomplete, that he'd calculated that worker injuries were an acceptable cost, that he'd never personally visited the territories where he sent workers, and had no intention of ever doing so because he was an executive, not a laborer. Auntie asked him how much profit Nordic Berry Enterprises had made in 2014, and Christian answered proudly that it had been their most successful year with 8.2 million euros in profit, and Auntie asked how much of that profit Christian had personally taken home, and Christian said 1.6 million euros in salary and bonuses, and Auntie let that number hang in the courtroom silence for a long moment before asking how much Sana had earned that summer, before a bear destroyed her face, and Christian didn't know, had to have his lawyer look it up, and the answer was 4,200 euros for 3 months of 12-hour days in dangerous wilderness conditions. Auntie asked Christian if he thought the disparity was fair, if he thought someone who actually harvested the berries should earn 0.005% of what he earned for managing the company from an air-conditioned office. And Christian made the fatal mistake of getting defensive and saying that he'd built the company through his business acumen, and workers were compensated according to market rates for unskilled labor, and if they didn't like it, they were free to find other employment. Auntie asked if he considered Santa's 30 years of wilderness experience and survival knowledge to be unskilled labor, if he thought playing dead under a bear's claws for 30 minutes was something just anyone could do, if he thought the ability to survive what would have killed most people was worthless compared to his business degree and connections. Christian said that was unfortunate, but irrelevant to the legal question of whether the company was liable for a wild animal attack, and Auntie said actually it was completely relevant, because it showed the contempt with which Nordic Berry Enterprises viewed its workers as disposable tools rather than human beings whose lives had value. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned a verdict that awarded Santa 1.2 million euros in damages plus full medical expenses for life, and found Christian Virtanen and Nordic Berry Enterprises guilty of criminal negligence resulting in severe bodily harm. The criminal charges meant prison time, not just fines, and the judge added 7 years to be served in Riihimäki prison, along with additional fines that would bankrupt the company unless it was sold. The civil judgment included a requirement that Nordic Berry Enterprises implement comprehensive safety reforms and submit to government oversight for 5 years, and that they fund a victim compensation program for other workers who'd been injured in their operations. The verdict sent shockwaves through the Finnish business community because it established precedent that executives could be held criminally liable for worker safety violations, that corporate shields didn't protect individuals who made negligent decisions that resulted in harm, that the cost of cutting corners on safety could exceed any possible profit. Santa sat in the courtroom, listening to the verdict, with tears streaming down her scarred face. Not tears of joy exactly, because nothing could restore her eye, or erase the trauma, or give back the pieces of herself that had died in that bog, but tears of validation, of being believed, of knowing that the powerful could be held accountable when the vulnerable refused to be silenced. Christian Virtanen's face went from disbelief to rage, to the pale shock of someone watching their entire life collapse in real time. And as the bailiffs approached to take him into custody pending appeal, he turned to Santa and said something that the microphones didn't catch, but that those nearby heard clearly. He called her a greedy bitch who destroyed his life over an accident that wasn't his fault. And the statement was so disconnected from reality and basic human decency that even his own lawyers looked disgusted. The appeals process took another year, but the verdict was upheld, and Christian Virtanen began serving his sentence in the spring of 2017, 3 years after the attack. His wife divorced him 6 months into his incarceration and took half of whatever assets hadn't been seized to pay the judgment, and his children changed their last name to distance themselves from the scandal. Nordic Berry Enterprises was sold to a workers' cooperative that implemented the safety protocols that should have existed all along, hired a full-time wildlife safety officer, provided emergency communication equipment to all workers, and established a profit-sharing system where seasonal workers received bonuses based on company performance. The reforms became a model that was adopted by other berry-picking operations across Finland and eventually influenced EU regulations on seasonal agricultural work in wilderness areas. Sanna used a portion of her settlement to pay off Alina's student debts and establish a scholarship fund for working-class students pursuing healthcare careers, named it the Mikko Virtanen Memorial Fund after her late husband, and took deep satisfaction in knowing that something positive had emerged from her trauma. She kept enough to live modestly without working, bought a small cottage near the forest but not in it, somewhere she could see the trees and remember the beauty without being triggered by the proximity. She became an advocate for workers' rights, speaking at labor conferences and policy meetings, her scarred face and missing eye giving weight to her testimony about the human cost of corporate negligence. She never picked berries again, couldn't bring herself to return to that work, but she maintained friendships with seasonal workers and fought for their rights with the same stubborn determination that had kept her alive in the bog. Heikki became something of a local hero, the retired cop who'd taken down a corporate criminal, and he continued investigating workers' rights violations as a volunteer consultant for labor organizations, using his skills to expose negligence and hold companies accountable. He and Sanna developed a deep friendship built on mutual respect and the bond of people who'd fought together for something important, and they met regularly for coffee, where they talked about cases he was working on and the progress of the reforms they'd fought for. Prani returned to Thailand with enough money to retire comfortably, but she corresponded with Sanna through translated emails, two grandmothers from different worlds, connected by shared experience of exploitation and survival. Alina graduated with top marks and got a position at Oulu University Hospital in the trauma unit, specializing in emergency care, and she told people that her mother had shown her what real strength looked like, that surviving wasn't just about living through trauma, but about refusing to let trauma define you or silence you. She visited her mother every month, brought her grandson when he was born, and told him stories about his grandmother's courage, about how she'd faced a bear and a courtroom and won both battles through stubbornness and principle. The boy grew up knowing that justice wasn't automatic or easy, that it required people willing to fight even when the odds seemed impossible, that ordinary people could hold powerful ones accountable if they refused to be intimidated or bought off. The changes to Finnish labor law that resulted from Sanna's case were comprehensive and meaningful, requiring wildlife surveys before any seasonal work in wilderness areas, mandating emergency communication equipment for all remote workers, establishing criminal liability for executives who approved operations without proper safety certifications, and increasing penalties for companies that retaliated against workers who reported safety concerns. Labor advocates called it the Virtanen Law in Sanna's honor, and it became a template for similar regulations in other Nordic countries, and eventually influenced EU-wide standards. The law had teeth because it included provisions for surprise inspections and whistleblower protections, and personal criminal liability that executives couldn't shelter behind corporate structures, and it fundamentally changed the calculation of risk versus profit in industries that employed vulnerable workers. But perhaps the most important change was cultural rather than legal, the way Sanna's case shifted public perception about the worth of working-class people and their labor. The image of her scarred face became iconic, appeared in labor rights materials and safety campaigns, a visceral reminder that behind every cheap product were human beings whose bodies and lives had value beyond their economic productivity. People who bought berry products started asking about where they came from and how they were harvested, started supporting companies that treated workers fairly, and boycotting those that didn't. And the market pressure accomplished what regulations alone might not have, creating financial incentives for ethical behavior. The berry-picking industry transformed from one of the most exploitative to one of the most reformed in Finland, and workers who'd once been voiceless and disposable found they had power when they organized and demanded better conditions. Christian Virtanen served his full 7 years without parole, refused to the end to acknowledge that his decisions had been anything other than sound business practices, maintained that he was a victim of political correctness and activist judges who didn't understand how business worked in the real world. He was released in 2024, 65 years old and broken by prison and the loss of everything he'd built, and he tried to restart his business career, but found that no one would work with him, that his name had become synonymous with corporate greed and negligence. He ended up managing a small convenience store in a suburb, the kind of working-class job he'd spent his life looking down on, and former workers who knew what he'd done would sometimes come in just to see the mighty fallen, to remind themselves that justice, however delayed, could eventually arrive. Santa lived to see her grandson graduate high school and her daughter become head of the trauma unit at Ulu, lived to see the reforms she'd fought for celebrated as models of worker protection, lived to see 3 more companies prosecuted under the law that bore her name, their executives sentenced to prison for putting profit above safety. She died peacefully in her sleep at 71, 15 years after the bear attack, and her funeral was attended by hundreds of seasonal workers who'd benefited from the changes she'd forced into existence, by labor organizers who'd used her example to push for reforms in other industries, by the journalists who told her story, and the lawyers who'd fought for her, and the friends who'd supported her through the darkest times. Alina gave the eulogy and talked about her mother's courage, not just the physical courage of surviving the bear attack, but the moral courage of standing up when it would have been easier to take the money and stay silent, the intellectual courage of believing that one working-class woman could change systems designed to protect the wealthy and powerful. The lesson of Sanna's story spread beyond Finland, became part of the global conversation about workers' rights and corporate accountability, was taught in law schools and business ethics courses as an example of how individual courage, combined with public pressure and legal action, could force meaningful change. It demonstrated that honor and integrity weren't the exclusive province of the wealthy and powerful, that sometimes the truest strength came from those society marginalized and overlooked, that protecting others rather than dominating them was the real measure of power. The story proved that redemption was possible even for corrupt systems, if enough people demanded accountability, that cycles of abuse could be broken when victims refused to be silenced, that justice moved slowly but could arrive inevitably for those who never stopped fighting for it. If you found this story meaningful, if it reminded you that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice when they refuse to accept that power means the right to harm others without consequences, then share it with someone who needs to hear that message today. Subscribe to witness more stories about real courage and real justice, about people who stood up when standing up seemed impossible, about the battles that changed systems, and protect future generations from the exploitation that came before. Comment below about what you would have done in Santa's position, whether you think you could have fought for years knowing the odds were against you, whether you believe justice is worth pursuing even when the price is high and the outcome uncertain. This story honors not just one woman's survival and courage, but all the invisible workers whose labor sustains comfortable lives, whose bodies break so others can profit, whose voices deserve to be heard and respected and protected by laws that value human dignity above corporate earnings. And if we remember nothing else, let us remember that true strength isn't about dominating others, but about protecting them. That real power comes from standing up for what's right, even when it costs us everything, and that justice delayed is still justice if we refuse to stop fighting until it arrives. The blood spreading across the snow looked black in the twilight, and Sarah Chen couldn't tell anymore if she was still screaming or if the sound had simply become part of the wind that howled down from the rock.